Robinson's severed leg is discovered on the shores of Lake Michigan in Cudahy's Warnemont Park. Her car found set on fire near 30th and Lisbon, and Anderson spotted on nearby bus security cameras.
April 2nd, 2024, early evening in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A man was walking along the beach near the base of the bluffs when he noticed something in the sand ahead of him. As he moved closer, the shape became clear, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Lying there in the sand was a human leg. The toenails were painted pink. So, he called the police. Officers arrived and secured the area, and at that moment they did not yet know whose leg it was or how it had ended up there. They only knew that the cut was not accidental and that whatever had happened, it had happened recently. But what they did not realize yet was that less than 24 hours earlier, that leg belonged to a 19-year-old college student who had gone on a first date. And within the next 48 hours, investigators would connect that discovery to a burned Honda Civic found in an alley on the north side of the city, to a young woman who had been reported missing by her family and co-workers, and to a man who had been captured on surveillance cameras moving across Milwaukee in the early morning hours. And as those pieces came together, the search widened from a single shoreline to parks, wooded areas, and neighborhoods across the city, because detectives understood something disturbing very quickly. This was Sade Carlina Robinson.
Demon and his whole ass attorney, they knew exactly what he did and what he was responsible for. They took us through extreme agony and...
I took this to trial without ever once trying to make a plea deal of any kind, because I did not commit these crimes. And so I plan to appeal my conviction.
But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Sade Carlina Robinson was born on May 10, 2004, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, to her parents, Sheena Scarborough and Carlos Robinson. She was their first child, and from the beginning, she carried herself with a kind of independence that stood out. When she was just under 2 years old, her mother moved with her to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that is where most of her childhood unfolded. However, her life was not limited to one place, because she also spent time in Florida with her father, moving back and forth during her early years, learning to adapt, learning to belong in more than one world. As a teenager, she briefly relocated to Florida to live with her dad and attended Ida S. Baker High School, but she grew homesick and returned to Milwaukee in late 2019. She enrolled at Riverside University High School and, determined to stay on track, she graduated early. That decision alone said a lot about who she was. After high school, she enrolled at Milwaukee Area Technical College in 2022, where she chose to study criminal justice. And by the spring of 2024, she was just 1 month away from completing her associate degree. May 2024 would have marked that milestone. She was 19 years old and already mapping out the next steps. But Sade did not just study. She was also an employee at Pizza Shuttle since 2021, and in addition to Pizza Shuttle, she worked a second job at the Wisconsin Club, and she even helped her younger sister, Adriana Reams, secure a job there as well. By 19, Sade had bought her own car, secured her own apartment, and managed her own bills, and her discipline showed in a post she shared after returning from a solo trip to Jamaica in early 2024. She described it as her first trip out of the country and said she had worked hard for it, juggling 5 classes while working 60 to 80 hours a week and still maintaining a 3.5 GPA. But that's not all. She was considering enrolling in the U.S. Air Force and following in the footsteps of veterans in her family. But on April 1st, 2024, with her degree nearly complete and her life steadily expanding, she agreed to meet someone new, and that was where the tragedy began. Maxwell Stephen Anderson was born on May 26, 1990, and by the spring of 2024, he was 33 years old and living on the south side of Milwaukee near South 39th Street and Oklahoma Avenue. On the surface, he blended easily into the city's nightlife scene. He worked as a bartender at several local establishments over the years, including venues like The Rave and Jukes on Water, and at one point he had also worked at the Twisted Fisherman, the same seafood restaurant that would later become part of this case. To most customers, he appeared to be just another familiar face behind a bar counter, someone who poured drinks, made small talk, and went home after closing time. But there was more to his history, and much of it was documented in court records long before he ever met Sade Robinson. In April 2011, Maxwell enlisted in the United States Navy, and records show that his service lasted until January 2012. The circumstances surrounding his discharge were not fully detailed in public documents, but his time in the military was brief, and he returned to civilian life in Wisconsin less than a year after joining. From there, his record began to grow. Between 2014 and 2022, Maxwell accumulated several criminal charges across Waukesha County and Door County. Court documents reflected incidents involving disorderly conduct and domestic, as well as operating a vehicle while intoxicated. In one 2014 case tied to an incident involving a family member, he was convicted of misdemeanor disorderly conduct. In a separate 2015 case in Door County, records showed charges connected to domestic violence and intimidating a witness. There were additional citations related to alcohol-related behavior and confrontations. And while many of these cases resulted in misdemeanor convictions or reduced outcomes, they established a pattern of volatility that followed him into his 30s. Former partners later described behavior that aligned with those records, including heavy drinking, jealousy, and controlling tendencies. He lived alone at the house on South 39th Street, a modest property that would later become central to the investigation. And then there was the dating history. By early 2024, Maxwell was active on multiple dating apps, including Hinge, Tinder, and Bumble. Investigators later confirmed through digital records that he spent significant time on these platforms, arranging dates and communicating with women in the Milwaukee area. That digital activity would become critical once detectives began retracing the final hours of Sade Robinson's life. Because Sade met him online, the two connected through a dating app in the weeks leading up to April 1st, 2024, and according to phone records later presented in court, their conversations escalated from app messages to direct texting. They exchanged plans, discussed meeting locations, and arranged a first date. There was nothing in those early exchanges that suggested danger. On paper, it looked like what millions of people do every day, two adults agreeing to meet for dinner. And by April 1st, they had plans. That morning, she video chatted with her mother, Sheena Scarborough, and Sade mentioned that she had a date later that evening. She even took extra time choosing what to wear, and she decided on ripped blue jeans, a white top, white shoes, and a black puffy coat. As she headed downstairs, she briefly spoke with the building secretary and mentioned that she was meeting someone for the first time that night, and nothing about that conversation stood out at the time because it felt normal, routine, even hopeful. By mid-afternoon, the plan was still coming together through text messages. At 4:15 p.m., Sade reached out to Maxwell Stephen Anderson to confirm where they would meet, and the exchange that followed would later be preserved in investigative records. She asked about the location and timing, and he initially suggested meeting downtown. He then mentioned he needed to stop at the Twisted Fisherman to pick up his W-2 form from when he had worked there, and he asked if they could eat there first. Sade responded that she was feeling seafood, and he replied, "Sounds good. I'm about to leave. I'll be there soon." A few minutes later, he texted, "Just got to Twisted." She replied, "Okay, are you inside?" And he answered, "Yes." At 5:09 p.m., surveillance confirmed Maxwell arrived at the Twisted Fisherman. At 5:20 p.m., Sade arrived in her Honda Civic. Cameras showed her parking and walking inside, and the two greeted each other at the bar. Staff later confirmed that Maxwell had previously worked there, which meant he was familiar with the layout and the employees, and that detail would matter later. They ate, they talked, and they ordered drinks. Surveillance footage showed them seated together at the bar for about an hour, appearing relaxed and engaged in conversation. There were no visible signs of distress, and nothing in the footage suggested conflict. To observers, it looked like a typical first date. At approximately 6:29 p.m., they left the restaurant together in Sade's Honda Civic, with Sade driving and Maxwell in the passenger seat. Traffic cameras then captured the vehicle heading toward downtown Milwaukee, and by 6:35 p.m., they arrived at Duke's on Water, a busy sports bar on North Water Street. Inside Duke's, surveillance again showed them at the bar, ordering drinks and interacting casually. At one point, they were seen leaning in close and hugging briefly. They remained there for several hours, moving between the bar and the seating area, and nothing outwardly signaled that anything was wrong. According to investigators, this was the last confirmed public footage of Sade alive. At 9:24 p.m., the Honda Civic arrived near Maxwell's home on South 39th Street and Oklahoma Avenue. A security camera captured the back gate of the property opening, and two figures were seen entering through the backyard rather than the front door. The footage showed movement consistent with two people walking toward the house, and then the gate closed behind them. Phone data later confirmed that Sadie's device remained in that location for approximately 3 hours. Cell tower pings and app-based location sharing data placed her phone within a tight radius of that address from shortly after 9:24 p.m. until just after midnight. During that time, there were no outgoing calls for help, no signs of her leaving, and no additional public footage of her movements. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. There were no recorded disturbances. From the outside, the house appeared quiet. And then, sometime after 12:45 a.m. on April 2nd, movement resumed, but not from Sade. Surveillance cameras in the alley captured the Honda Civic leaving the property. However, there was no footage of Sade walking out. She was never seen leaving that house, but her phone did. Cell phone tower data and app-based location tracking placed the device traveling south and then looping back towards central Milwaukee. At one point, it passed near Sade's own apartment building, but surveillance confirmed she never returned home. Instead, the phone kept moving, crossing neighborhoods in the early morning darkness while most of the city slept. Shortly after 1 a.m., the phone pinged near a park area along the Milwaukee River, consistent with Pleasant Valley Park and the surrounding Marina Road area. Data indicated the device remained there for a short period before continuing east toward Lake Michigan. Then, between 2:45 and 3 a.m., the phone's location data placed it near Warnemont Park, the same park where hours later a severed human leg would be discovered. At 2:53 a.m., surveillance cameras near the park entrance captured a vehicle matching Sade's Honda Civic entering the area. The gate arm was struck and broken as the vehicle drove in, and debris consistent with a Honda Civic was later recovered at the scene. A nearby pump house camera then recorded a lone figure walking toward the shoreline at approximately 3:02 a.m. The footage showed the individual moving between the beach and a service road multiple times over the course of more than an hour. Investigators later noted the repeated trips between the vehicle and the shoreline, and the timeline became critical. The vehicle remained inside the park until approximately 4:31 a.m., when it exited and drove away. During that entire window, Sade's phone remained in the same general vicinity. By 4:35 a.m., the car had left Warnemont Park, and the device data showed it traveling again through Milwaukee. What investigators would later reconstruct was a route that crossed several parts of the city in the early morning hours. And at approximately 7:30 a.m., Milwaukee County 911 received calls reporting a vehicle fire near 29th Street and Lisbon Avenue. One of the witnesses later described what she heard. She said she heard a car alarm going off and then a loud pop that sounded like an explosion. She later told reporters that the vehicle burned, and she did not believe the fire had started on its own. She observed that the interior was already engulfed, and she contacted the fire department immediately. Fire crews arrived and extinguished the flames, and what remained was a heavily damaged Honda Civic. The interior had been burned extensively, but the exterior still bore identifying markers. Investigators were able to recover the vehicle's registration sticker, and that allowed them to identify the owner quickly. The car belonged to Sade Carlina Robinson. Inside the trunk area, investigators located remnants of clothing and fragments of an iPhone that had been exposed to fire. The vehicle's interior showed signs that the blaze had been intentionally set, and that determination shifted the case from a missing person to a criminal investigation. By that point, detectives were already aware of a severed leg discovered at Warnemont Park hours earlier, and they were beginning to suspect that the two scenes were connected. Meanwhile, on the morning of April 2nd, Sadie did not arrive at her scheduled shift at Pizza Shuttle. She was known for her reliability, and coworkers immediately noticed her absence. Her manager, Justin Romano, later stated that she never missed work without calling ahead, and when repeated attempts to reach her by phone failed, concern grew quickly. Throughout the morning, coworkers tried calling and texting her, but there was no response. So, later that day, a friend and colleague known publicly as AJ decided to check on her in person. AJ drove to Sade's apartment building and noticed something alarming right away. Her Honda Civic was not in its usual spot. She knocked on the apartment door and called out her name, but there was no answer, and that silence pushed AJ to contact police and request a welfare check. Officers went to the apartment, but Sade was not inside. There were no obvious signs of disturbance, and without more information, they could not immediately determine what had happened. However, while police were beginning their checks, Sade's family had already started looking for her themselves. Her mother, Sheena Scarborough, along with other close family members and friends, had access to the Life 360 app that Sade used to share her location. They opened the app and traced her movements from the previous night. The map showed her traveling from the restaurants downtown to a residence on South 39th Street, and then later, in the early morning hours, to several areas across Milwaukee. The final location displayed before her phone battery died was Warnemont Park. So while police were still treating this as a missing person case, her family drove to Warnemont Park and began searching the shoreline and wooded areas themselves. They walked the bluffs, looked toward the water, and tried to make sense of what they were seeing on the app. They did not yet know what had already been found there earlier that day. At 5:29 p.m. on April 2nd, Milwaukee County Dispatch received a call from a man who had discovered a severed human leg along the beach at Warnemont Park. Officers responded and secured the area, and investigators began processing what was now clearly a major crime scene. The leg had been severed just below the hip socket, and the medical examiner's preliminary assessment noted multiple cutting impressions around the amputation point. The femur bone showed signs that it had been partially sawed through, indicating the use of a sharp instrument with repeated force.
How's it going? What's up, man? So, this is Evan Millies. We've dealt with him before. Sometimes, mostly a good guy. He's gotten into this trouble a couple times, but good dude.
Okay.
So they walked down the S curve from Sheridan, started walking south just for fun, rough day on the beach. As they were walking, see that leg right there?
Yeah.
Said that it was up about approximately where the end of that stick, that branch is.
By the bushes right there.
Yeah, bushes. Said that they saw it up
So it's
there.
like up on the hill, kind of?
Yeah.
Okay.
So said that him and his buddy, who's in my squad right now, walked out, called us, and then when we came back, it was about, I don't know, maybe 7 feet east.
Find a rock.
I moved it just for evidence purposes.
Okay, so this gets swept away?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I documented it well on body cam with different angles of where it was. And
Okay, cool. All right, we gotta...
You want to tell me where it is?
You should come this way?
Yeah.
Yeah? The first time you seen anything here? Yeah? It's the first time you seen anything like this?
At that moment, detectives still did not have confirmation that the remains belonged to Sade Robinson, but they strongly suspected a connection given the Life 360 data and the burned vehicle found earlier that morning. Samples were sent for DNA testing, and while investigators continued working through surveillance footage and phone records, the lab results came back. The DNA from the severed leg matched Sade. And with that confirmation, what had begun as a search for a missing 19-year-old became a confirmed homicide. Detectives were no longer looking for a lost person. They were reconstructing a crime that had already taken place. They now had a burned vehicle, body parts discovered in separate locations, digital movement data across the city, and a last known companion. But transit surveillance added another layer. Footage from a Milwaukee County Transit System bus captured a man matching Maxwell's clothing walking away from the area where the burned Honda Civic would soon be discovered. He was seen wearing a dark zip-up hoodie and carrying a tan backpack. He boarded a bus using cash and later exited near Lakefield Drive, a short walk from his home. But that's not all. Investigators also collected physical evidence. When they examined the entrance gate at Warnemont Park, they recovered broken vehicle fragments. Those fragments were later matched to a Honda Civic consistent with Sade's car, confirming that the vehicle had struck the gate while entering the park in the early morning hours. And with this mounting evidence, detectives secured a search warrant for Maxwell Anderson's residence at 3161 South 39th Street. During the search, they located blood on bedding and on a wall leading toward the basement. However, subsequent forensic testing confirmed that the blood did not belong to Sade. Reports later indicated that it was canine blood, which investigators documented accordingly. Even so, the presence of blood and cleaning materials raised questions about what had occurred inside the home. In the garage and storage areas, officers found gasoline containers. That detail aligned with the burned vehicle discovered earlier that morning. The prosecution would later argue that these materials supported the theory that the car fire had been intentionally set. Meanwhile, the recovery of additional remains intensified the investigation. On April 5th, in a wooded area near 31st and Galena, close to where the Honda Civic had burned, investigators located a left foot with pink-painted toenails, consistent with the leg discovered at Warnemont Park. Additional human tissue was also recovered nearby. Each discovery confirmed that Sade's remains had been scattered across multiple locations, and each scene required separate processing, separate forensic documentation, and separate searches. Then, on April 18th, a man walking along the Lake Michigan shoreline near 3305 Marina Road discovered a torso and an arm that had washed ashore. Authorities responded and collected the remains for testing. These remains were later confirmed to belong to Saade. By that point, investigators had recovered a right leg, a left foot, a torso, and an arm, but her head was not found. And on April 4th, 2024, just 2 days after the initial discovery at Warnemont Park, officers conducted a traffic stop near his residence. Body cam footage captured the moment he was detained. And on April 12th, 2024, 10 days after the first remains were discovered, prosecutors formally charged Maxwell Stephen Anderson. The charges were severe and specific: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, arson, and hiding a corpse. The criminal complaint laid out the digital trail, the surveillance footage, and the physical evidence collected across multiple scenes. Bond was set at $5 million, cash, meaning he would need to post the full amount to be released pending trial. And as the case moved forward, the prosecution relied heavily on what they described as a consistent chain of surveillance and data. Assistant District Attorney Ian Vance Curzon described the killing and dismemberment as the highest level of violence imaginable, and he told jurors that the evidence was not isolated but connected. But the defense, led by attorney Anthony Cotton, challenged that interpretation. Cotton argued that prosecutors had failed to prove intent, which is required for a first-degree intentional homicide conviction. He emphasized that there was no direct video of the act itself and no audio capturing what happened inside the home. He also pointed out that no neighbors reported hearing a struggle that night. Cotton argued that when Anderson boarded the bus after the vehicle fire, he did not conceal his identity and was not visibly covered in dirt or debris, despite the state's theory that he had been in a muddy park area. The defense suggested that the state was drawing conclusions from circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof of intent. The trial began on May 27, 2025, more than a year after the initial arrest. Over the course of the proceedings, jurors heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses who described the discovery of the remains and the recovery of the burned vehicle. They reviewed phone records, location data, and surveillance footage from multiple sources. They were shown how Sade's last known movements aligned with Anderson's movements and how the timeline narrowed to a 3-hour window inside his home. And on June 6, 2025, after deliberating for approximately 45 minutes, the jury returned verdicts on all counts. Maxwell Stephen Anderson was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, arson, and hiding a corpse. The decision marked the legal conclusion of the trial phase of the case. On August 1, 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison. Under Wisconsin law, the life sentence carried no possibility of parole unless modified by the court at a future date, and the judge imposed the maximum term allowed. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Anderson maintained his innocence. He stated, "I did not commit these crimes, and so I plan to appeal my convictions."
I would like to start by saying that from the bottom of my heart, my deepest and most sincere condolences go out to Sade's family, as well as everyone else affected by this tragedy. That being said, Your Honor, I took this to trial without ever once trying to make a plea deal of any kind, because I did not commit these crimes. And so I plan to appeal my convictions, while I hope and pray that further investigations not only prove my innocence, but find and deliver true justice.
Anything else you wish to say?
No, ma'am.
State court. However, the impact of what happened on April 1st and April 2nd, 2024 extended far beyond the courtroom.
Comments to me, please.
First off, Your Honor, I would like to thank you and the entire team for what we all had to endure, which was it was freaking torture to even have to be dragged through what we were dragged through. This demon and his whole ass attorney, they knew exactly what he did and what he was responsible for. They took us through extreme agony and pain. We are already dealing with so much trauma. There's no such thing as justice with what you did to my daughter, what you have done to my family. I have bust my ass for over 20 years to raise the best possible angelic light worker kids that do nothing but good. My daughter had to cross your demonic path. You plotted and planned to kill, dismember, then you disrespectfully spread my daughter across the Milwaukee like a piece of trash. How dare you? My daughter was everything. She was everything to all of us. As my baby explained, she had a different impact in each and every one of our lives. There's so many strangers and individuals in the community that I have engaged and met that she has touched and impacted. This has affected the world, the community in such extreme ways. There's no way in hell we should have even ever went through this freaking trial that you drug us through. You knew you were guilty. You're negligent, mammy and pappy, them demons. I'll deal with them later.
Boss Milwaukee, pink became the color of remembrance because it had been Sade Robinson's favorite. Within days of her disappearance, and then again after her remains were confirmed, community members gathered outside Maxwell Anderson's home for what became known as a Pink Out event. At Pizza Shuttle, where Sade had worked and where co-workers had waited for her to walk through the door on the morning of April 2nd, a mural was later painted in her honor near the entrance. Customers and staff stopped to take photos, and some left notes. Her manager and colleagues described her as outgoing and uplifting, someone who made sure to tell people to be careful going home at the end of her shifts. That detail stayed with many of them. A scholarship fund was also created in her name to support students from Riverside University High School. For her family, the fund represented more than financial assistance. It represented continuity. It meant that even though her life was cut short, her goals and values would still help someone else move forward. But the grief remained layered and complicated. Community searches for additional remains continued for weeks, and volunteers walked along beaches and wooded areas hoping to bring closure to her family. Authorities used boats to search portions of Lake Michigan, while several major remains were recovered, including a right leg, a left foot, a torso, and an arm. Questions remained about whether every part of her body had been located. Sade's mother, Sheena Scarborough, spoke publicly more than once. At one point, in the height of her anguish, she compared the case to a 2024 Jeffrey Dahmer, referencing Milwaukee's painful history and demanding accountability not just for her daughter, but for other missing women in the area. She said there were black and brown girls who had gone missing and whose cases had not received the same attention, and she vowed that her family would not remain silent. Her father, Carlos Robinson, spoke about the moment he was told the DNA matched. He said his world crashed down. He described physical pain in his chest and the shock of losing his first child. He said she had changed his life when she was born, and that he had still been hoping she would walk through the door until the confirmation came. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. When a jogger came across Gemma Hayter's body, there was no sign of struggle nearby. There was no obvious scene that explained how a 27-year-old woman had ended up dead beside a disused railway line in Rugby. What investigators would later discover was that Gemma had not been attacked by a stranger. She had not been followed, and she had not been dragged there against her will. She had walked there. CCTV footage would later show Gemma moving through the town just after midnight with 5 people she believed were her friends, walking close enough to look like friends, making sure she got home safely. But they did not take her home. They led her somewhere else. And by the time the night was over, Gemma Hayter had been unalived by the very people she believed were there to protect her. The question was how it had come to this at all, how a woman so vulnerable had ended up placing her trust in 5 people who would later destroy her, and how the people she called her friends became the ones who took her life. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Gemma Hayter was born in the early 1980s, the youngest of 3 children. And from the very beginning, her family sensed that something about her development was different. Her mother, Sue Prince, noticed it first. Although Gemma was affectionate and warm, always eager for closeness, always reaching out, but as she grew older, it became clear that she was not keeping pace with other children in the ways people expected. She learned more slowly, struggled to process information, and found it difficult to navigate situations that seemed effortless to others. At school, those differences became harder to ignore. Gemma received some support in her early years, but it was inconsistent, and it never quite addressed what she needed most. She struggled academically, but more than that, she struggled socially. She wanted to fit in, to be liked, to be included, but she did not always understand the rules that governed friendships. She missed cues, trusted easily, and when that trust was misplaced, she did not always recognize it. Sue did what many parents would do. She asked questions, pushed for answers, spoke to teachers, doctors, and social services, trying to understand why her daughter was falling behind and what support might help her cope. And over time, Gemma underwent assessments and evaluations. She was evaluated 29 times between the ages of 13 to 19. But the results were often unclear or conflicting. One professional suggested a learning disability, another raised the possibility of autism, but later those labels would be questioned or removed altogether. Nothing stayed consistent long enough to build a stable plan around. As Gemma moved into her teenage years, the support she had began to thin out. She was transferred to a special school for secondary education and later placed in a specialist residential college, which offered structure and supervision. But even then, the focus often shifted toward managing her behavior rather than understanding the reasons behind it. Services came and went, files were opened and closed, and responsibility quietly passed from one agency to another. What never changed was Gemma's need for connection. She wanted friends, she wanted to feel chosen and to be part of something. Over time, she learned a difficult lesson. Being tolerated was better than being alone, and even unfair terms felt safer than being left out entirely. So she forgave easily, overlooked insults, and stayed loyal to people who did not always treat her kindly, because the alternative was isolation. And it was that need more than anything else that shaped the choices she made next. By the time Gemma Hayter reached adulthood, she wanted what most people her age wanted. She wanted independence and wanted her own space. She wanted to prove that she could live like everyone else. And when professionals assessed her and decided she was capable of living alone, that desire was taken as confirmation that she was ready. So Gemma was given an apartment in a council tower block in Rugby. Her family were uneasy about it from the start. They worried that she was being given too much responsibility too quickly. But Gemma wanted this step, and she wanted it badly. She wanted to show she could manage on her own, and she wanted to be seen as capable. Because of that, she was protective of her independence. She did not always welcome family visits, and she did not always want help, even when it was offered. Letting people step in felt, to her, like stepping backwards. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it became clear that Gemma was struggling. The structure she relied on was gone, and without it, daily life began to unravel. The flat deteriorated, and basic routines slipped. The environment became unhealthy, neighbors noticed the smell coming from the property and raised concerns. Police were called, family members contacted authorities, worried about her living conditions and the people she was spending time with. Support workers flagged the same issues, noting that although Gemma had asked for independence, she was not coping as well as the system assumed she would. Cases were closed, files were passed on, but no one stepped back to look at the pattern forming in front of them. Meanwhile, Gemma was aware that she was struggling and knew she needed help, so she tried to ask for it. At one point, she wrote directly to the authorities asking for a job. She said she needed her independence, but she also said she wanted someone to help her when she asked for it. It was a careful balance she was trying to strike. She was not rejecting support. She was just asking for support that respected her dignity. But that support never truly materialized. And as agencies continued to debate eligibility, capacity, and responsibility, Gemma was left navigating adulthood largely on her own. So she looked elsewhere for connection and spent more time outside her flat. She wandered around Rugby, stopping where people gathered, lingering in places where conversation and company were easy to find. It was in that space that Gemma became known to a small group of young adults who were themselves drifting between flats, pubs, and streets around the town. They drank heavily, used drugs, and lived without much structure, and they were often short of money. At first, the relationship looked like friendship. They talked to her, they let her follow them around, and invited her to drink with them. Then, gradually, expectations formed. Gemma began doing things for the group. She ran errands, shared what money she had, and let them into her flat whenever they asked. Over time, her flat stopped feeling like her own. It became somewhere the group could drink, take drugs, and come and go without consequence. They also began using her to take risks they did not want to take themselves. Gemma was pressured into stealing from shops and told it was harmless, that it was just helping out. She was made to keep drugs in her flat, and when she asked what they were, she was told they were presents or something she was only holding temporarily. Gemma repeated those explanations when questions were asked. She did not see herself as being exploited. Within this group, Chantel Franklin Booth became central to Gemma's life. Gemma called her best friend and held on to that label even when it hurt. Chantel mocked her, laughed at her, and humiliated her, sometimes openly. Chantel lived with her partner, Daniel Newstead. He was volatile, already known to probation services, and he exerted control without needing to say much. When Daniel was around, Gemma became quieter, and she learned to agree, to avoid confrontation, and to do what was asked of her, because staying on his good side meant staying included. Other members moved in and out of the same circle. Joe Boyer, younger than the rest, followed along and took cues from those around him. Jessica Linus, already known to police, shifted between conflict and reliance on Gemma. Duncan Edwards, recently back in rugby, slipped easily into the same routine of drinking, drifting, and taking advantage of what was available. They continued to live what seemed to them as a normal life, until one night, a small moment disrupted the balance, a joke, a comment that landed the wrong way, and everything changed. The evening of Saturday, the 7th of August 2010, began like many other nights for the group. They met up in Rugby Town Center, moving between pubs, drinking heavily, and drawing attention wherever they went. Gemma was with them, staying close, trying to match their energy, and eager not to be left behind. The night did not feel dangerous at first. It felt familiar. As they moved from one venue to another, they ended up at a club, and while speaking to a bouncer, Gemma made a joke about Chantel's age. It was offhand and not meant to cause offense, but it landed badly. The group was refused entry, and then they were ejected altogether, and what might have been a forgettable moment immediately became something else. The frustration of being turned away was settled on Gemma. The laughter was replaced by irritation and blame. Words were exchanged, voices rose, and they shoved and pushed her as they walked down the road. The following day, she then went to Chantel's apartment to collect her belongings, and once in the flat, the situation escalated. They started to bully her again. Gemma was and during that, her nose was broken. The injury was serious, yet it did not bring the violence to an end. She was pushed into the bathroom and locked inside. She tried to reach out for help, but her phone was taken from her, and when she asked for it back, she was ignored. The battery was removed and flushed down the toilet, a deliberate act that ensured she could not contact anyone. When she was eventually let out, the abuse continued. At one point, urine was poured into a can and forced on her to drink. Hours passed inside that flat. Gemma was visibly injured, distressed, and exhausted, but no one called for medical help or tried to stop what was happening. Eventually, after everything she had been through, Gemma said she wanted to go home. Just after midnight, Gemma Hayter walked back out into the streets of Rugby with the same 5 people she had been with all evening. The town had quieted by then, shops were closed, traffic had thinned, and the noise of the night had faded. But what had happened inside the flat followed her outside. She walked behind them as they moved through the town, staying close. Her face was visibly injured, her movements slower than before, but she remained calm. She did not try to break away or argue. She believed she was finally being taken home. CCTV cameras recorded the walk in fragments. The group passed through pools of light and shadow, moving steadily forward. At one point, she spoke again that she wanted to go home, but they did not turn toward her flat. They did not slow down. They just kept going. They led Gemma Hayter away from the street and down toward a disused railway embankment on the edge of town. It was dark and quiet there, separated from passing traffic and hidden from view. She went with them, moving carefully over the uneven ground, and once they reached the embankment, the violence resumed. A plastic bag was placed over Gemma's head. She struggled instinctively, trying to pull away, trying to breathe. The bag was removed, but the reprieve did not last. It was placed back over her head again, cutting off her air and leaving her disoriented. She was terrified by then, but there was nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She was once, but the injury did not end what followed. She was beaten again, struck while she was already weakened and struggling. The assault continued in silence, away from witnesses, away from any chance of interruption. Afterward, her clothes were removed. Her body was left where it had been dragged, alone on the embankment. There was no attempt to help her, no call for assistance, and no moment where anyone stopped what was happening. When they walked away, Gemma Hayter was left behind. She was found hours later, drowned in her own from her broken nose. Gemma Hayter's body was discovered later that morning by a jogger passing along the disused railway line. The jogger stopped, realized something was wrong, and contacted the emergency services. What had been quiet and hidden hours earlier was suddenly sealed off, and the embankment became a crime scene. Police arrived and confirmed that Gemma was dead. Almost immediately, the focus shifted from discovery to investigation. The nature of her injuries made it clear that this was not an accident and not a sudden act of violence by a stranger. A murder inquiry was launched, and detectives began working backwards through the final hours of her life. CCTV footage became central to the case. Cameras across Rugby had recorded Gemma moving through the town just after midnight, surrounded by 5 people. Those recordings provided a timeline, and they identified who had last been with her while she was still alive. Forensic examinations confirmed what the footage suggested. Gemma had suffered extensive injuries. Some were inflicted earlier, others later, and together they painted a picture of prolonged violence rather than a single event. The injuries did not match the place where her body was found, which told investigators that what killed her had begun somewhere else. And what came next was not speculation or theory. It was evidence laid out in court. The case went to trial at Warwick Crown Court, where the events of that night were laid out carefully and in full. Jurors were shown CCTV footage of Gemma's final walk through Rugby. They heard medical evidence describing the injuries she had suffered and listened as witnesses described what had happened inside the flat and what followed afterward. The verdicts were clear. The case was then moved to sentencing at the Old Bailey, where the court addressed not only what had been done to Gemma Hayter, but how it had been done and by whom. Lady Justice Rafferty delivered the sentencing remarks. Her words were measured, but they carried the weight of everything the court had heard. She described the killing as a chronicle of heartlessness, and she spoke directly to the defendants about the cruelty they had inflicted. Referring to what Gemma had endured, she said, "I struggle to see how much lower you could have sunk." Describing Gemma's final hours, Lady Justice Rafferty told the court that Gemma had tagged along like a faithful, loving dog, a phrase that showed not only Gemma's loyalty, but the extent to which that loyalty had been. As she concluded, the judge made the reality of the outcome unmistakable. "Gemma Hayter died alone," she said. The sentences reflected the seriousness of what had been proven. Chantel Franklin Booth, Daniel Newstead, and Joe Boyer were each sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, with minimum terms set at 21 years, 20 years, and 16 years respectively. Jessica Linus and Duncan Edwards were convicted of manslaughter and received sentences of 13 and 15 years. With those words, the courtroom closed the chapter of the case. Responsibility had been assigned and punishment had been handed down. After the sentences were handed down, Gemma Hayter's family spoke publicly about the woman they had lost. They described Gemma as loving, trusting, and vulnerable, and they spoke about how her kindness had been taken advantage of by the very people she believed cared about her. They talked about the pain of the trial, the strain of hearing the details laid out in court, and the reality of knowing that nothing said or done there could bring Gemma back. Gemma Hayter's mother said that Gemma had always seen the best in people, and that she believed she could have forgiven the people who hurt her if she had survived.
Any difficulties, she was very vulnerable. Even though they did that to her, I'm quite sure that if she survived it, she'd have forgiven them.
Gemma's sister, Nikki, spoke about the moments that haunted her most. She said she often wondered what Gemma must have been thinking during the hours she was being.
I don't know what she could have been thinking. She was probably thinking, what on earth's going on? I've done nothing to these people. She was probably in a hell of a lot.
What happened to Gemma Hayter was later described as mate crime. It was not a crime committed by strangers or by someone unknown to her. It was carried out by people who presented themselves as her friends, who gained her trust, stayed close to her, and then used that trust to control, exploit, and ultimately harm her. In the months that followed, a serious case review was carried out to examine how Gemma had been failed long before the night she died. The findings showed a pattern that had repeated quietly over years. Different agencies had information about Gemma's vulnerability, police had been called, family members had asked for help. Each service held part of the picture, but no one ever stepped back to see the whole of it. And because Gemma had been judged capable of independence, her risk was repeatedly underestimated. The review did not identify one single moment where everything went wrong. Instead, it revealed how small omissions, missed opportunities, and closed cases had gradually narrowed the space around her. Gemma Hayter's case showed how vulnerable people can be harmed by those they trust most. Her story is a reminder that exploitation often hides in plain sight, and that silence can be just as dangerous as violence. Thank you for watching. If you have thoughts on this case, leave a comment below. And if you want more carefully researched true crime stories, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It began with a sentence that no officer expected to hear during a routine welfare check. "There are cats in the freezer." The detective looked at the 10-year-old girl standing in front of her and asked again, carefully this time, "Cats are in the freezer?" But the child didn't argue or hesitate. She simply confirmed it, as if she had already accepted that this was normal. Only minutes earlier, officers had walked into the home on South Ozark Avenue in Truman, Arkansas, responding to a call about a child's well-being. The smell struck them first. It was hard to ignore. Sergeant Blaine Cagle later said the ammonia burned his nose and chest, and he had to use his inhaler after stepping inside. In one bedroom, the child sat quietly on a bare mattress. She appeared embarrassed. She told officers she couldn't remember the last time she ate. They checked the kitchen and found only minimal food. Outside, 3 adults were already in handcuffs after officers found and glass pipes in a backyard shed. And by the end of that afternoon, 4 people were headed to the Poinsett County Detention Center. The child would be removed from the home, and the house itself would later be declared uninhabitable. 24 counts of aggravated animal cruelty would be filed. The case would make headlines across Arkansas. And yet, months later, one of the people charged would stand in court, plead guilty to a single count, and walk away with probation. So how did a welfare check uncover 24 frozen animals, a child living in unsafe conditions, and a drug arrest all in one afternoon? To understand that, we have to go back to July 2nd, 2025, and the knock on the front door. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. On July 2nd, 2025, at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, officers with the Truman Police Department pulled up to a house on the 600 block of South Ozark Avenue. The call had come in as a welfare check. An anonymous caller had asked police to check on a 10-year-old girl living at the residence, and that was enough for officers to make the visit. They walked up to the entrance and knocked, but no one answered immediately. They waited, then knocked again. A few more seconds passed, and then the door finally opened. Standing there was 38-year-old Samantha Lynn Platts. She looked at the officers and immediately offered an explanation for the delay. "I'm disabled. It takes me a minute to get out of bed," she said, as if anticipating the question before it was even asked.
Channel 1.
Truman Police welfare check. Come to the door, please. You were just standing at this front door.
I'm disabled. It takes me a minute to get out of bed.
Okay, somebody was standing right here.
When officers told her they had received a call requesting a welfare check on a child in the home, Samantha responded quickly. She said her daughter was upset because she wouldn't let her go somewhere, and she suggested that was likely the reason for the call. She framed it as a family disagreement, nothing more. According to her, everything was fine inside. The house, she insisted, was clean. She pointed out that her bedroom might look messy, but the rest of the house was fine. And when officers asked who else was on the property, she told them that Body E. Williams was in the back, like he usually was. So, the officers explained that they needed to see the 10-year-old girl to confirm she was safe. Samantha didn't refuse, and she led them further inside, talking as she moved, repeating that things were under control and that the situation had been exaggerated. She told them her daughter was in her room, and she emphasized again that the house was fine. But when they crossed the threshold and entered the home, the smell hit them first.
Back there somewhere. Alright, well.
When officers spoke to her, she answered their questions calmly. She told them she could not remember the last time she had eaten. That statement shifted the focus immediately, so officers checked the kitchen. They opened cabinets and looked through the refrigerator, and what they found confirmed her words. There was only a minimal amount of food in the home, not enough to suggest regular meals were being prepared. And when Sergeant Blaine Cagle stepped inside, he immediately understood that this was not going to be a simple welfare check. Later, he would describe it clearly. I was immediately met with the odor of ammonia, causing my nose and chest to burn. He had asthma, and within moments he felt the irritation build in his lungs, so he had to use his inhaler just to steady his breathing. But that's not all. Flies moved along the walls and ceilings, landing and lifting again in restless patterns. Fleas clung to clothing, and gnats hovered in the air. As officers moved forward, they saw what the smell had warned them about. There were more than 10 cats inside the home, and the floors were covered in layers of waste, trash, and scattered debris. Cat urine and feces were visible across the surface of the rooms, and the buildup looked long-standing rather than recent.
Just called me back. Take pictures. Get work on? Yeah. Pictures of everything. Hi, Courtney. There's 2 Courtneys and 1 Zip. Okay. Are you, hopefully you can come here where we are, huh? Yeah, she said she was going to refer to you. I think it's a very good idea based off the circumstances. I don't know that this 10-year-old needs to do it.
As they continued through the house, they noticed structural damage as well. The floors sagged in places, and some areas felt unstable underfoot. In the bathroom, the situation was worse. The floor had fully collapsed, exposing the crawl space underneath, so there was a visible gap where the structure had given some.
The odor in here is so foul. There's no oxygen. The house is filled with flies, and the floor is caving in some parts, and there's just junk and trash and cat poop and pee in every square inch of it. So.
Way. However, as serious as those conditions were, they were still not the only issue officers were about to uncover at the property. While Sergeant Blaine Cagle and other officers remained inside the house assessing the child's condition, another group moved toward the backyard because Samantha had already told them that Body E. Williams was in the back, like he always is. The officers walked past scattered debris and toward a shed on the property, and when they approached, they found 3 adults inside. Body E. Williams was there, along with Kevin Jones and Doris Arnold. All 3 were known to law enforcement, and as officers began speaking with them, they confirmed something important right away. Each of them had search waivers on file, which meant officers did not need additional permission to conduct a search. Officers instructed them to step out one at a time, keep their hands visible, and as one officer began searching their persons, another looked around the shed. That was when he saw it. A small bag containing a white powdery substance was located inside the space, and although it hadn't yet been tested, officers already suspected what it was.
Extensive previous traffic, state and federal numbers, 56.
Okay, so you were dispatched. I'm not taking over.
Before moving further, they read each of them their Miranda rights. Then one officer addressed them directly. "There's dope in there. Whose is it?" he asked plainly. There was no immediate answer. Instead, each of them denied ownership. No one stepped forward. No one accepted responsibility. So, with no admission and with the substance still present in the shed, officers made the decision to place all three under arrest. The white powder would later test positive for methamphetamine. In addition, officers located 3 glass pipes commonly used to smoke. That discovery added paraphernalia charges on top of possession. Within minutes, Buddy E. Williams, Kevin Jones, and Doris Arnold were in handcuffs and being escorted away from the shed. At that point, it might have seemed like the most serious issue on the property had already been uncovered. Drugs were present, arrests had been made, and the welfare check was already revealing unsafe conditions inside the home. However, the officers remembered something else mentioned in the original call. The caller had raised concerns about dogs possibly being locked in the shed without food or water. So, even with 3 arrests already in progress, officers shifted their attention again. They began asking about dogs.
I got you. Okay, so another mention was made of dogs being kept in a shed back here. You know anything about that?
There's no dogs. There hasn't been dogs for months.
You don't have any dogs on the property?
No.
Okay.
There hasn't been dogs in there for almost over a year because police took them a year ago.
Okay. All right. Like I said, we got a call, and that was one of the accusations made, right?
I know, it's my daughter. Because I told her no, that her sister couldn't go to Cherokee with her this weekend.
Well, I don't think your daughter called in a welfare check on herself.
My eldest.
Oh, not that daughter. You have another daughter.
I have an eldest.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm with you now. I was like, I don't think that's what happened, but I'm with you. Okay, I understand. And it may have been, I honestly have no idea. I didn't get a name.
Oh, I know exactly who it was because I had just told her no, not even 5 minutes before y'all knocked.
Yeah. Okay.
When questioned, Samantha denied that there were any dogs on the property. She insisted that police had taken them months earlier and that there hadn't been dogs there in a long time. But as officers continued scanning the property, something caught their attention near the driveway area. On body camera footage, one officer noticed a pile of bones and a skull, and it appeared to be skeletal remains consistent with a dog.
I bet Bodie knows what that is.
Deer don't have teeth like that, do they?
I mean, that would be the back towards
No, flip the skull back around. That's a freaking dog, dude. That's a dog.
In a driveway area, investigators find a pile of bones suspected to be the remains of a dog, seconds before the child lets them in on a darker secret.
That is a dog head.
You can tell by the back teeth. I don't know how many cats.
Still, even with confirmed, arrests made, and suspected animal remains found outside, the most significant discovery at that house had not yet been made. And while the arrests were unfolding outside and officers were still documenting the condition of the house, Detective Amy Carey stayed focused on the 10-year-old. The girl had watched strangers walk through her home, seen people placed in handcuffs, and listened as officers discussed drugs and unsafe conditions. So Detective Carey chose a softer approach. At one point, the child looked at her and asked a simple question: what is going to happen to all the cats? Detective Carey reassured her that a rescue organization would take care of the animals inside the house, and she explained that they would make sure the cats were safe. For a moment, it seemed like the conversation would end there. But then the child added something else. What about the cats in the freezer? Detective Carey paused. She wasn't sure she heard that correctly. What about the cats in the freezer? She asked, repeating the words carefully. There are a lot of dead cats in the freezer, the girl said. The officers nearby heard the exchange, and what had already been a serious situation became something else entirely, so they conducted a second search.
Because now I'm thinking about animal cruelty.
Yep. One there. There's one back here.
She said there's 12.
Shut up, dude.
Nope. Okay, not that one.
Okay, I just went in here. Oh my god.
What's that? Is that what that is? Oh. That's not a cat. Oh, dang.
It's probably these.
That's watermelon.
Refrigerator, maybe?
There's a freezer right here as well. Sorry. I don't know if it's a freezer.
fridge. At this point, oh, you want to go get the kid? No, never mind, okay.
One officer lifted the lid of the first one, and for a brief second, there was silence, because what they saw required a moment to process. Inside were cardboard boxes and plastic bags.
Come on, dude. Come on. Oh my God.
Yeah. Take pictures of it.
Oh, it's in both, Blaine. It's in both.
Inside those were cats and kittens, frozen solid. They were various ages. Some were newborn, others were juvenile or fully grown. Officers began counting carefully because the number mattered. The total came to 24. The discovery was documented in detail. Officers observed that many of the animals appeared severely underweight, and some were positioned in tight curls. Sergeant Blaine Cagle later noted that some may have been placed in the freezer alive, based on what he observed at the scene. An animal cruelty investigator would later say that certain curled positions suggested the possibility that some had been frozen while still alive. What began as a welfare check had become a case involving drugs, unsafe living conditions, skeletal remains outside, and now 24 frozen animals inside the home. As officers were still processing what they had found inside the freezers, another vehicle pulled up outside the house.
Next, the child's adult sister and caller of the welfare check arrives to take custody of the 10-year-old, who was later released to her care, according to court documents. At the same time, a social worker arrives to assess the situation.
I've already had her at our residence. She was temporarily with me for a little while.
It's probably gonna be a lot longer. So. It's gonna be up to her ultimately.
Okay.
We don't deal in that. We won't even come to your house because we can't go to bay.
Yeah.
But if it's like this, then it won't happen.
Oh, I know.
So if it's
It's fine.
okay.
The adult sister, the one who had either made or prompted the welfare call, arrived on scene. She stepped out knowing something was wrong, but she had no idea how serious it had become. When officers spoke with her, she didn't hesitate to explain why she had pushed for the welfare check. She said the situation at the house had been building for a while and that this wasn't a one-day concern. She explained that there had been plans to take her younger sister to Cherokee Village for the weekend, and she believed the child should not have been left behind in that house. However, Samantha had made last-minute changes and told her she couldn't go. That raised questions. Then she learned that recently released individuals had moved into the home, and that made her even more uncomfortable. And given everything discovered inside and outside the house, officers made the decision to contact the Arkansas Department of Human Services. DHS was required in cases involving potential neglect, and this situation clearly met that threshold, so a social worker was dispatched to the scene to assess the child's immediate safety and determine the next step. The social worker arrived while officers were still documenting evidence, and conversations began about temporary custody. The adult sister had already expressed willingness to take her younger sibling, and after reviewing the circumstances, DHS allowed the child to leave the property with her sister. Meanwhile, arrangements were made for the live animals inside the home. A rescue organization was contacted, and the remaining cats were removed from the property. Code enforcement was also notified, and after reviewing the structural damage and sanitation issues, the residence was declared uninhabitable. The house on South Ozark Avenue was no longer considered safe for anyone to live in. With the child placed in her sister's care and animals being taken away, officers turned their attention back to Samantha Lynn Platts. The evidence documented that day extended beyond neglect and poor conditions, and charges were being prepared. She was informed of her arrest, and then she was placed in handcuffs.
For the welfare check, but the animals were found because my sister said something.
This woman, who we're not identifying, called Truman Police July 2nd out of concern for the safety of her younger sister and worried about a man who started living here recently with their mother.
He appeared one day to install an air conditioner and he never left.
Truman Police found more than they expected during their interview of the child.
And so they came and talked to her, and then as they were talking to her, she had asked about the cats in the freezer. And so apparently there was a lot of cats in the freezer.
She says more than 24 deceased cats were discovered. Some animals on the property, however, were found, but in very poor condition and are being cared for.
Buddy E. Williams, Kevin Jones, Doris Arnold, and Samantha Lynn Platts were transported to the Poinsett County Detention Center, where the booking process began and the charges were formally entered. For Kevin Jones and Doris Arnold, the charges stemmed from what officers had found inside the backyard shed. The white powder recovered there tested positive for methamphetamine, and 3 glass pipes had been located alongside it. As a result, both were charged with possession of methamphetamine and possession of drug paraphernalia. Their involvement was tied directly to the shed and the drugs discovered during that search. For Buddy E. Williams, the charges were broader and far more serious. He was charged with 24 counts of aggravated animal cruelty, 1 count corresponding to each of the frozen cats and kittens found inside the deep freezers. In addition to those counts, he also faced charges of possession of a Schedule 1 or 2 controlled substance and possession of drug paraphernalia based on the items recovered in the shed. Samantha Lynn Platts faced similar animal cruelty charges, also totaling 24 counts. However, her case extended further because she was the legal guardian of the 10-year-old girl found inside the home. So in addition to aggravated animal cruelty, she was charged with endangering the welfare of a minor. That charge reflected the documented living conditions, the minimal food supply, the structural hazards inside the residence, and the presence of drugs on the property.
4. Police charged 38-year-old Samantha Lynn Platts with endangering the welfare of a minor and aggravated animal cruelty.
She's always been a cat hoarder. This is the first about the dead cats. Apparently she says she wanted to cremate them, but I don't know where that was going.
37-year-old Bodie Eugene Williams is charged with this.
And on December 8th, 2025, proceedings took place in the 2nd Judicial Circuit Court, with Judge Pam Honeycutt presiding. Buddy E. Williams appeared before the judge that day, and instead of moving forward with a full trial on 24 counts of aggravated animal cruelty, he entered a negotiated guilty plea. It was not to 24 counts. It was not even to multiple counts. It was to 1 count of aggravated cruelty to a dog, cat, or equine. That distinction mattered. The original arrest involved 24 counts corresponding to the 24 frozen cats and kittens discovered inside the deep freezers. However, under the negotiated agreement presented in court, Williams pleaded guilty to a single count. In exchange, the remaining counts were addressed through dismissal or reduction. Judge Honeycutt then imposed the sentence. Williams was ordered to serve 36 months of probation, with 24 of those months supervised. He was prohibited from owning or being around pets, and he was required to pay all court costs and fees in $50 monthly installments. The agreement also resulted in 8 other animal cruelty charges being null prost, meaning they were formally dismissed. Additionally, the drug possession and paraphernalia charges connected to the shed were dismissed as part of the plea arrangement. There was no jail sentence imposed under that agreement. Williams avoided incarceration and left the courtroom under probationary supervision instead. The case that had once centered on 24 counts concluded, at least for him, with 1 conviction and structured supervision rather than confinement. However, that was not the end of the legal story. Samantha Lynn Platts' case remained open. She still faced 24 counts of aggravated animal cruelty and a charge of endangering the welfare of a minor, and her matter had not yet been resolved in court. So while one defendant had reached a negotiated outcome, the broader case connected to that house on South Ozark Avenue was not entirely closed. The house itself was declared uninhabitable and condemned due to structural damage and unsafe living conditions, so it was no longer a place where anyone could legally reside. Code enforcement had reviewed the collapsing floors, the exposed crawl space beneath the bathroom, and the sanitation hazards throughout the property, and the determination was final. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
This case is one of the most horrific cases I ever heard. This is a 14-year-old that was murdered, raped, had her hands cut off, and her throat almost cut off. This is an absolute animal that came into our town.
On March 24th, investigators entered an abandoned house in East Toledo to follow up on a lead in a missing child case. The building had been vacant for years, damaged by a fire no one had ever fully explained. But that morning, officers moved carefully through the structure, and within minutes they requested additional units. Something inside required the coroner. Word reached the crowd gathering outside long before officials confirmed anything. A young girl had been found in the upstairs portion of the house, and people quietly asked whether it might be the 13-year-old who had been missing for nearly a week. Her family had been pleading for information, her school had reported her absence, and volunteers had spent days handing out flyers. And the last person who publicly said he saw her last, her father, was no longer in Toledo. He had been on television earlier that week describing himself as a worried parent. But by the time her body was discovered, police were already searching for him. The questions that followed were straightforward but impossible to ignore. How did a missing child investigation lead officers to an abandoned house? Why were there inconsistencies in the accounts given earlier? And how did the person who appeared on camera asking for help become the focus of a statewide manhunt? This is the case of Kaymani Lateague, a case still unfolding, still under investigation, and still raising questions about what happened in the days before she was found. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Before the search teams walked the streets of Toledo, and before the police put out a statewide alert, Kaymani Lateague was simply a 13-year-old girl trying to grow up in a life that had never been straightforward. She was born on March 28, 2011 in Ohio, to Darnell Ogletree Jones and Tiara Caston, and the two were already living separate lives when she came into the world. And her custody was never a clean line that anyone could easily trace. From the beginning, Kaymani's life was divided between adults who loved her but struggled to create a stable place where she could stay for long. When she was still a baby, she lived with her mother's godmother, a woman who stepped in before Kaymani was even a year old. This godmother helped raise her, helped provide for her, and continued doing so even years later. But as Kaymani grew, things changed, and around 2019 or 2020, she moved in with her grandmother Dorothy Lateague in Toledo. Dorothy took on the responsibility of raising her, even though the legal paperwork confirming guardianship didn't come until 2024, long after Dorothy had already been doing the work. Life with Dorothy wasn't perfect, but it was the place Kaymani called home. They lived with 2 dogs, and the house was the kind of home where a child learned early what to do when the adults had long shifts and weren't always around when school ended. Dorothy worked demanding hours, so Kaymani became what people often call a latchkey kid. She had her own set of keys, she carried a phone, and she followed a routine that she rarely broke. She went straight home after school, checked in, and stayed inside unless she asked for permission to go elsewhere. Even at 13, she carried herself with a sense of responsibility that made adults trust her. At Spring Elementary School, where she was a 7th grader, the staff saw a side of her that didn't always show up at home. Teachers said she was an honor roll student who tried hard in every class, and she was weeks away from receiving a kindness award. She greeted her teacher with a hug every morning, and she shared her breakfast without being asked. She helped other students who didn't understand their assignments, and she did it without making anyone feel embarrassed. People who knew her at school didn't talk about her in vague, polite terms. They said she was warm, thoughtful, and genuinely good. She liked older music, the kind her grandmother played around the house. She loved Ms. Pac-Man, often leaning into the arcade machine with a kind of competitive joy, and she also played basketball and football. When Dorothy had visitors, Kaymani naturally drifted toward the younger children, keeping them entertained and laughing. Kaymani's 14th birthday was just days away, and she told Dorothy that she wanted a basketball-themed party. She was thinking about decorations and colors and how everything would look, and she had every reason to believe she would be there to celebrate it. But while she was picturing balloons, jerseys, and cake, her life was moving towards something she didn't see coming. On Saturday, March 15th, Kaymani spent the day with her mother, Tiara Caston, and that visit began when Darnell Jones dropped her off in front of Tiara's home. Tiara later said that Dorothy, the grandmother raising Kaymani, had given him permission to bring her by, and there was nothing unusual about that arrangement. They were a complicated family, but they still tried to make space for moments that felt simple and familiar. Tiara remembered that day clearly because it had been one of the rare times she had her daughter all to herself, and she described it as a peaceful afternoon filled with laughter, video games, and the kind of closeness she had missed. And after that visit, Kay Manny went back to Dorothy's house. Sunday, March 16th began like any other day in their routine, but that night, something happened. Late in the evening, Kay Manny called her father, and Darnell later told reporters that she sounded frightened. According to him, she said she thought someone was trying to break into the house, and she didn't want to be alone. It was the kind of call no parent ignores, so he said he got in the car, picked up his cousin, and they drove to Dorothy's neighborhood in Toledo to check on her. Darnell's version of the night remained consistent when he spoke on camera. He said he and his cousin stayed with Kay Manny till about 12:30 in the morning, believing she was calm enough to handle the night, especially since she was used to being home alone when Dorothy worked long shifts. That was the story he told the media, the police, and anyone who asked where he had been. But phone records later added details that didn't fit neatly into the picture he painted. Kay Manny's phone showed a call to Darnell at 1:29 a.m., a call he said he missed, and after that, she called his girlfriend several more times. The timing suggested she had still been trying to reach someone even after he claimed he had reassured her and left. And by the time Monday morning came, the girl who always went straight home and always showed up for school suddenly wasn't anywhere. When Dorothy Latigue came home on Monday morning, she expected to walk into the same quiet routine she had lived with for years. She had worked an early shift and the house should have been locked the way she left it, with Kay Manny getting ready for school or already on her way. But the moment she stepped onto the porch, she felt something was wrong. The front door was unlocked, hanging open in a way that seemed strange, because Kay Manny never left that door open, not even once. She pushed the door the rest of the way and immediately saw that the house wasn't just unlocked. It was in complete disarray and nothing about it felt familiar. Dorothy walked through the living room, trying to understand what she was looking at, and the first thing she noticed was the gas stove, turned on without a flame. The house felt like someone had left in a hurry or like someone had been interrupted before they could finish whatever they were doing. She moved farther into the living room and saw Kay Manny's glasses lying beside the couch. That struck her hard because Kay Manny needed her glasses for most activities, and near the glasses were her underwear, and the confusion only deepened when she saw Kay Manny's pajamas on the dining room floor, tossed aside. Her keys were still inside too, and that was the moment Dorothy's worry turned into fear, because Kay Manny would never walk out of the house without them. She called out her name and walked through every room, but the house stayed quiet in a way that felt wrong. She grabbed her phone and dialed Kay Manny's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. She tried again, and the same thing happened, so she did what any guardian would do in that moment. She called 911. But before police even reached the house, Dorothy called the school. The secretary checked the attendance records and told her that Kay Manny had never arrived that morning, which was very unusual because Kay Manny always showed up. When officers arrived, Dorothy filed the report, and that made it official. Kay Manny Latigue was a missing child. Her information went out to patrol units, to surrounding jurisdictions, and eventually to state databases. The next day, Dorothy stood in front of a television camera and tried to explain the scene she had walked into. She believed that the more people understood about that morning, the more likely they were to recognize that something terrible had already happened. Before the police ever filed a missing person report, Kay Manny Latigue had already tried to tell the adults around her that something in her life wasn't right, and her school happened to be one of the only places where she felt comfortable enough to speak. Kay Manny told her teachers that she didn't feel safe at home, and this wasn't the kind of claim a teacher takes lightly, especially when it comes from a child who rarely complained about anything. Her teacher, Karen Harabedian, noticed more than words. She saw the way Kay Manny held herself at the end of the school day, and she saw the fear that would show up in her eyes when it was time to pack up. Karen saw too, and she couldn't dismiss them as normal childhood scrapes because they didn't match the way Kay Manny played or the way she carried herself at school. Because teachers in Ohio are mandatory reporters, Karen called Lucas County Children's Services, also known as LCCS, more than once, and she wasn't the only one. Other staff members called too, including the school bus driver, who had seen enough to be worried. Their reports weren't vague. They were specific concerns about a child who was showing signs of fear and possible harm. There were other concerns as well. During one of the CPS assessments, Dorothy said that she sometimes used physical discipline and that admission should have mattered. But when CPS spoke to Kay Manny alone, she told them she felt safe at home with Dorothy. Children often minimize what they experience, especially when they don't know what will happen if they tell the whole truth. So, the caseworkers noted the conflicting information, and they documented the visit, and then they moved on, And even outside the official interviews, there were more signs. One of Keimani's classmates remembered her coming to school with on her arms and saying that she and her grandmother had been fighting. To another child, that might have sounded like a normal household argument, but adults knew better. Fear and repeated comments about not feeling safe should have been enough to trigger intervention. But the system didn't move quickly, and the pattern kept building. LCCS later confirmed that they had received at least 3 separate reports about Keimani, one in December 2023 and 2 more in March 2024. And when they reviewed the situation, they concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to remove her from the home. Instead, they gave Dorothy guidance about appropriate discipline and closed the case. And that was why, when news spread that Keimani was missing, her teachers said they felt a familiar kind of shock. They weren't surprised that something bad had happened. They were only surprised it had gone this far. On March 21st, the community organized a search party, and volunteers from the neighborhood, nearby towns, and surrounding counties showed up with flyers, flashlights, and the kind of determination that only appears when a child is missing. People walked through parks, alleys, abandoned lots, and wooded paths, and they stopped cars at intersections to hand out pictures of a 13-year-old girl whose smile they hoped someone recognized. Strangers who had never met her stepped into the search as if she belonged to all of them, because they understood that children don't simply disappear without someone noticing. While the search groups moved across the city, Tiara Caston Keimani's mother was collapsing under the weight of fear no parent imagined they would ever feel. She held up the flyer with shaking hands and begged people to share her daughter's face, repeating that she just needed one person to see the photo and say they recognized the child.
I have not ate in 3 days. We need all the support we can get from anybody. We don't care who it is. Please just come out and help us find my niece.
The next day, Sunday, March 23rd, a felony abduction charge filed against Darnell Jones. Jones is Keimani's dad, and court records show he was the last person with her before she went missing.
This man has been to my house several times. He usually takes her for weekends to his house to visit with him and his other children. And I feel deceived. Like, you played for so f***ing long in my face, like you was her dad, like you really had her best interests at heart. But where is she?
If my baby don't make it home, I will never be okay again. And I hate to say that because I have other kids.
From the beginning, law enforcement did not treat this as a runaway case because nothing about the scene supported that possibility. The trashed house, the unlocked door, the glasses, the keys, the stove, all pointed in one direction. Keimani was responsible, predictable, and deeply anchored in routines. She never broke those patterns, so detectives quickly leaned toward abduction, and the case escalated in urgency within hours. And while officers canvassed neighborhoods and interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something, one detail kept rising to the surface. Darnell Jones had been the last confirmed person to see her. Investigators took note of that immediately, and as they sat with him for formal interviews, they started noticing that some details of his story shifted depending on how the questions were asked. He repeated the broad outline, but the small things, the timing, the sequence, the calls, didn't always line up in the same way. Detectives compared his statements to phone records, to Dorothy's account, and to the physical evidence inside the house, and each time they did, the inconsistencies widened. But long before detectives began comparing Darnell Jones's timelines to phone records, his name had already appeared in court files and police databases across Ohio. His history stretched back to his late teens, and it showed a pattern that was impossible to ignore once investigators pulled the documents. He had been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct several times when he was still very young, and those early charges led to frequent court appearances where judges warned him to change his behavior. But he moved through those years without much stability, and the pattern continued into adulthood, creating a long trail of cases that painted a consistent picture of turmoil. One of the most significant early turning points was an arson case where he was accused of setting fire to a building. Instead of going to trial, he entered an Alford plea to attempted arson, which allowed him to maintain his claim of innocence, while acknowledging that the evidence against him was strong enough for a conviction. As part of his supervision, the court required him to attend treatment, keep a job, and work toward earning his GED. And for a while, he appeared to follow those conditions. But that period of compliance didn't last. By 2015, Darnell had become tied to more serious violence. According to police records, He fired a gun at a man at the Greenbelt Place apartments, then fled the scene before officers arrived. When he was eventually arrested, the court placed him under community control, but he violated those conditions several times. Each violation added new layers of supervision, extensions, and warnings, yet the behavior never shifted for long, and the cycle repeated itself again and again. There was also the incident where he struck a man with an alternator during an argument. It was so severe the victim required medical treatment, and Darnell was charged with felonious assault, a charge that carried serious consequences, even with a plea. He received probation and conditions he was expected to follow, but the violations continued, and his record accumulated more drunk and disorderly charges alongside the existing assault cases. The combination of alcohol, anger, and impulsive decisions kept showing up in his files, each incident reinforcing the same underlying pattern. His history also included DV, particularly a case involving his wife Antonia in 2019. Police reports documented an argument where he became physically aggressive, and neighbors later told officers they heard objects being thrown and saw him toss a television set off a balcony during the dispute. He eventually pled guilty to domestic violence, yet even with that conviction, the pattern didn't break. Each case added to the concerns surrounding his temper, especially when alcohol was involved. On top of those incidents were several cases tied to weapons, even though he was legally barred from owning firearms as a convicted felon. At one point, he was shot in the chest during a trespassing dispute, and instead of stepping away from dangerous situations, he was later found by police in a daycare parking lot, intoxicated and holding a gun. That arrest led to weapons charges and a plea agreement that sent him to prison for a year. When he finished his sentence, he entered post-release supervision, but the concerns about access to guns and volatile behavior were never fully resolved. Across the years, the pattern stayed remarkably consistent. Court documents described a man who struggled with intoxication, reacted with violence when angry, and repeatedly placed himself in situations that involved weapons, even when he was legally prohibited from having them. And as investigators reviewed those records during the search for Keimani, they realized that this long history had never been part of any child welfare discussion involving her. While the search for Keimani intensified across Toledo, Darnell had been spending most of his time at a small house on Willard Street, where he lived on and off with his girlfriend, Nina Turner, and their young child. Nina had been noticing small changes in his behavior long before police considered him a suspect, and those changes lingered in her mind in ways she couldn't ignore. After the incident happened, he had told her to turn off the security camera at her apartment, but she didn't comply. She also noticed the way he avoided eye contact when she asked what was going on. Something else unsettled her. A family member mentioned seeing Darnell slip something beneath the basement staircase, and one afternoon, when Darnell wasn't home, Nina went to the basement and opened the small closet under the stairs. Inside, she found muddy work boots and a rolled-up rubber cargo mat, the kind used to protect the back seat of a car when the seats are folded down. She knew immediately that something was wrong because he hadn't been working, and he never used those boots for anything not recently, not for months. So the mud on them didn't make sense, and neither did the way he had tried to hide them. Then she made the decision to call the detectives who had been canvassing neighborhoods and asked them to come to the house. When they arrived, she handed over the boots and the cargo mat without hesitation. Later, when Darnell returned and realized the items were gone, he didn't confront her or demand an explanation. Instead, he simply left the house and never came back.
The thing about it is because before they even showed up, he asked me to turn my cameras off. I have cameras in my house, and he asked me to turn them off. And I was like, why would you want me to turn the cameras off? He said, because I didn't come home till 5 o'clock that morning. And he didn't want them to suspect anything because he didn't show up till 5. And I'm like, well, thinking in my head, I'm like, well, if you don't have anything to hide, then why should I turn the cameras off? And I didn't, but he thought I did.
She and Jones have a 2-year-old daughter together. She says she was in the room when Jones tried to hide evidence connected to the case in her house.
After the police took us downtown and questioned us, I came back home before he did, and my family that was here informed me that he hid something under my stairs in my basement. So I called the detectives, and they came and did a search warrant and grabbed it. And once he noticed those were gone, that was the last time I seen him.
Police executed a search warrant. What did he hide under your stairs?
It was like a mat for the back of your truck, not a pickup, but SUV. You know, when you lay your seats down and you put that rubber mat in there to protect the back of your seats in case you're hauling something. That's what he rolled up and put in my basement. And his work boots, which were caked with mud. I never seen him put it under there, but I wasn't about to hold no evidence for him or none of that. He must have thought that.
Jones went on the run to Columbus, where he used to live.
After the search warrant and he disappeared, we left the house because I was scared that he might come back and harm one of us.
That silence frightened her more than any argument could have, so she packed what she could, gathered her daughter, and moved to a different location because she didn't know what he might do once he realized she had spoken to investigators. Days later, after she settled into her new home, he called her from a number traced back to Columbus, and she gave that information to the police too because she understood that withholding details was no longer an option. However, on March 24th, a building that had been standing on Chase Street long after it should have disappeared from the neighborhood became the center of everything. People in East Toledo had complained about it for almost 2 years because it felt like a place where trouble lingered. A fire had torn through its second floor back in May 2022, and firefighters never figured out what caused it, so the city marked the structure as unsafe and left a notice saying it was a public nuisance that needed to be demolished. In the early hours of the day, investigators lined the road and neighbors stepped outside one by one when they saw police tape, lights, and officers gathering near the front porch. And the longer the investigators stayed inside, the more residents walked toward the house, hoping for answers, but fearing what those answers might be. Tiara was among them, and she stood in the crowd with her hands shaking because no one would tell her anything.
I know if it's my baby, they still not telling me nothing. It takes nothing. It's nothing to take a picture. It's nothing to, you know what I'm saying, let me know when the coroner's bringing her out so I can see if that's indeed my baby. Y'all not saying nothing. And y'all can tell if it's a grown woman or if it's a little kid. My daughter tall, but she still has the body of a child. You know the difference.
So what are they telling you?
They're not telling me nothing. They ain't told me nothing. Not a word. Then they talking about it might be days before I be able to identify my child. Like, no.
Inside the house, investigators found the body of a teenage girl, but they didn't announce anything right away because they needed the coroner, and they needed the confirmation to be official. But word started spreading through the street before anyone came out to speak. People tried to read the expressions of the officers as they moved in and out of the doorway, and each minute made the truth harder to deny. And finally, the confirmation came. The coroner identified the girl as 13-year-old Kaymani Lateague, and the cause of death was ruled a homicide from injuries that no child should ever have suffered. Tiara collapsed when she heard it. She fell to her knees in front of strangers who tried to steady her, while she cried out for a daughter she'd been begging people to help find. Officers formed a wall around her when the crowd surged forward, and for a moment, Chase Street was filled with people crying, praying, and trying to make sense of the cruelty that had reached into a child's life and taken it away. Later that day, the mayor addressed the city and said it was one of the worst cases Toledo had ever faced, and the police chief admitted that even after 3 decades on the force, the cruelty of what they had just uncovered still stunned him. In the hours after Kaymani's body was identified, the grief inside Toledo spilled into the streets, and it did so fast. People gathered outside Dorothy Lateague's house within minutes of the news spreading, and what started as whispered anger quickly grew into shouting because rumors moved faster than facts. Some believed she had failed to protect her granddaughter, and others believed she knew more than she was saying, and those assumptions turned into threats. Dorothy wasn't even home yet when neighbors called her to warn her not to come back because a crowd was waiting outside, and some people were talking about harming her. She later said she heard someone threaten to blow up her house and others saying they would deal with her once she walked through the door.
My first question for you, yesterday lots of things was going on. We want to know specifically at your home, there was a lot of speculation online that you were being arrested, but when we checked with police, that was not the case. So can you further clarify on exactly what did happen yesterday at your home?
Well, I was called and told that there was a mob of people in front of my house. They were angry. It was more or less the people that were here earlier waiting to see if it was Kaymani that was in the home. And Basically, some people from the neighborhood had contacted me and said that there was a mob in front of my house and they were talking about what they were going to do to me once I came home. So the police, the detective, said that she would have a unit come out and help me get my things and more or less escort me off the property. I asked to be handcuffed just so they can get the away from my property.
Are you scared?
So no, I was never arrested. I was taken downtown, but I was never arrested.
Are you scared for your safety right now?
I am.
What are some of the things that you've been hearing and receiving from people?
They said they was gonna blow up my house. They said they was gonna do harm to me. It's just been a barrage of the different things that they've been stating.
The fear in those messages was enough for police to act. The next night, the city held a large candlelight vigil for Kaimani. Teachers, parents, friends, neighbors, and people who had never met her gathered under the same sky because the story had spread through the city. They held candles, prayed, and stood quietly in front of posters showing the girl who smiled in every school picture she ever took. But even while the city mourned openly and demanded accountability, the man who insisted he had done nothing but try to protect his daughter was already gone. He was on the run. When Toledo issued the statewide BOLO for Darnell Jones, it moved fast because detectives already believed he had left the city. His name, his alias, the vehicle linked to him, and his photographs were sent to departments across Ohio. The strongest lead came from someone who had already risked her safety once, Nina Turner, who told investigators that the number he used after disappearing traced back to Columbus. So the search shifted 2 hours south, and officers there started watching for movement around places connected to that phone. The break came when a vehicle tied to him was spotted, and SWAT units closed in before he had the chance to slip away again. When they found him, he was outside, and it was clear he had tried to change his appearance because his hair had been shaved close to the scalp. And instead of panic or surprise, officers saw something else. He looked calm in a way that didn't match the chaos surrounding the case. The team kept their distance as they moved into position because one wrong move could shift everything. They ordered him again to put his hands up, and he answered by telling them to just kill him over and over, as if he had already made his peace with whatever happened next. And even then, he kept one hand buried inside his pocket, which forced the officers to repeat their commands as they watched his shoulders tense just enough to signal movement. Then he pulled out a gun. The standoff ended in seconds, shots rang out, and when they struck him, he fell, but continued insisting he didn't want to live anymore.
What's your name? Kill me. Dude, show me your fucking hands right now. Pull your fucking hand out of your... I swear to God, pull your...
Shots fired. Shots fired. Dennis in a second. Medic, go.
Don't fucking move.
Don't move. Alright, suspect's down. All you guys are okay.
Don't move. He's got 33 right there.
33 in his hands.
No, it's a walkie-talkie, but there's 33s right here. Don't you move or you're gonna get shot, okay? All right? Got it. Yep. That's him. Somebody get out.
Somebody get on the main air. Get us a medic.
I'm working on it.
All right, on your belly. All right. I got cuffs. There you go. Thank you, brother. We'll get you help, okay?
I just want to die, bro.
No, I know, but we can't allow that.
I can't.
All right.
I don't want to live.
Get us some cruisers. Secure this scene.
Copy, I'm in radio.
All right. Who fired? Him in the car.
He did too.
All right. You did? I did not. Okay. He did. Okay. You good?
All right.
You good? All right.
I know.
All right.
Listen to me.
Listen, I gotta roll you off. I gotta get you up on your side, okay? I gotta get you up on your side. I got you. All right. Where you hit at, bro?
I don't know. All in my leg.
All in your leg.
He's all hit right here.
I know. He's hitting his arm once.
Oh my God.
Need a medic here now. Where's that?
He was transported to Wexner Medical Center in Columbus, guarded, stabilized, and prepared for surgery. And while doctors worked on him, prosecutors updated the list of charges he now faced. He was already wanted for abduction, and now investigators had linked him to the murder of his 13-year-old daughter. additional charges followed from the confrontation itself. After Keimani's death, the spotlight didn't stay on the suspect alone. It widened and turned toward Lucas County Children's Services, and residents treated the agency not as a side note in the tragedy, but as a central figure that now had to answer hard questions. And people who had followed Keimani's story from the moment she disappeared wanted to understand how so many warnings had been filed without any significant action taken. LCCS confirmed that they had received multiple reports about Keimani over the previous months, including concerns about discipline and emotional safety. Yet none of those calls led to her being removed or placed in temporary care. And while they had spoken with her alone and believed she felt safe in Dorothy's home, residents argued that the agency missed a pattern that had been obvious to teachers who saw her almost every day. Inside the agency, caseworkers painted a picture of a system stretched far beyond its limits. They described what Mondays looked like: 17 or 18 new intakes waiting to be assigned before they even logged into their computers, and units that were supposed to have 5 workers operating with only 2. The emotional toll was heavy, the hours were long, and turnover was so common that new workers often lasted only a short time before the pressure pushed them out. Every resignation meant fewer hands to manage rising caseloads, and that meant more delays, more cracks, and more children whose cases didn't get the attention they deserved. Some professionals argued that the very structure of the hiring process was partly to blame. Audrey Haroon, who managed a youth group home, said the agency's requirement that caseworkers hold bachelor's degrees in social work or related fields shut out people who had lived through foster care or child welfare themselves and who might have recognized danger signs more quickly. She believed that some of the best potential caseworkers were being filtered out before they could even apply, because they didn't meet a credential requirement that didn't always reflect real-world skill. The backlash grew strong enough that county commissioners decided they needed an independent review from outside the agency. They proposed a citizens task force, and within 24 hours, more than 30 people applied. By the time the deadline passed, over 200 applications were waiting to be reviewed. Applicants needed to meet at least one of several criteria: lived experience in the system, professional experience with child welfare, backgrounds in safety or criminal justice, status as a mandatory reporter, or recognized community leadership. The conversation in Toledo shifted from grief to reform, and Keimani's name appeared in discussions not only about her life and loss, but also about the structural weaknesses that needed to be repaired. And as painful as that shift was, many believed that if the system finally changed, it would be because the city refused to let her memory disappear into a file. Once Darnell Jones was stabilized at Wexner Medical Center and formally booked, the legal system moved quickly. A Lucas County grand jury returned an indictment that stretched across 15 separate counts, and the list showed how far-reaching the case had become. He faced charges for kidnapping, multiple offenses, evidence tampering, assaulting officers, and aggravated murder. And because of the severity of those charges, prosecutors confirmed that his case qualified as Ohio's first death penalty case in more than a decade, which immediately placed it under intense public scrutiny. Court records showed that at one point he admitted to being involved, but when he stood before the judge, he entered a not guilty plea. And under the law, he remained presumed innocent unless the state proved otherwise. His defense team were 2 attorneys assigned to represent him in what would inevitably be a long and complicated case. Bond became the first major battle. Initially, Darnell was held on a $4 million bond, a number high enough to reflect the severity of the allegations. But prosecutors argued that even that amount wasn't enough, and they pushed for the court to remove Bond entirely so he wouldn't have the chance to be released. The defense asked for time to reconsider a fair amount, but Judge Goulding sided with the state. So Darnell remained in custody without bond, which meant he would stay in jail until trial. During his early court appearances, he wore what the public quickly recognized as a turtle suit, the green, thick, suicide prevention garment issued to inmates who were considered at risk of harming themselves. The decision to place him in that suit came from the jail's mental health and safety protocols, especially considering the behavior officers had witnessed during the Columbus standoff. It signaled that the facility was treating him as someone who required close monitoring, not only because of the charges, but because of his emotional state after the arrest. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering evidence beyond what had already put him in handcuffs. They executed a search warrant at the home of his cousin, seizing devices, GPS data, and other items they believed might clarify the timeline. They also pulled phone records that contradicted earlier statements made by Darnell's mother about when she last had contact with him, which suggested that she may have known more than she initially said. And while Dorothy had repeatedly stated that she and Keimani lived alone, police uncovered calls linked to Lisa White, the woman who sometimes stayed in the home and watched Keimani, even though she claimed she wasn't there the night the girl disappeared. These developments surfaced quickly and were still unfolding when the case entered the court system, which meant the investigation continued to widen even as attorneys prepared for trial. And every new piece of information hinted that the story around Keimani's final moments might be more complicated than anyone first understood. After investigators finished their work inside the abandoned house on Chase Street, the city moved quickly to erase the place where the community's heartbreak had begun. The property had already been marked for demolition, but officials accelerated the timeline because people couldn't bear to pass the house knowing what had happened there. So crews prepared the site, and volunteers came together to save everything the neighborhood had left for Keimani, every candle, every stuffed toy, every folded note. They carried the memorial piece by piece to a safer spot nearby. The move took almost 2 hours, and when they finished, the new memorial stood taller than the first. Then something unsettling happened. The house caught fire again before crews could tear it down. Officials didn't immediately know how it started, but they suspected arson. At the new memorial site, people used spray paint to say what they felt the city had failed to say earlier. Words like, "Her life mattered," "You let them silence her," and "CSB, where's your accountability?" covered the walls. As the city prepared to lay Keimani to rest, another dispute surfaced. Both Tiara and Dorothy believed they should be the one to decide her funeral arrangements, and a court had to intervene because their tension had grown the way grief often does, quiet at first, then overwhelming. The judge granted Dorothy the right to oversee the service because Keimani had lived with her for more than 5 years. Donations the public had given were transferred from one funeral home to another as the details shifted, but people continued giving because they wanted to do something, anything, that felt helpful in a moment when no one knew. In the end, Keimani's story didn't fade into the background the way so many stories do. As 2025 ended, Keimani Latigue's case was still unfinished. Her father, Darnell Jones, faced 15 serious charges, and the judge kept the death penalty specifications in place. His attorneys signaled they would argue he has a serious mental illness, a claim that could change what the trial looks like when it begins in 2026. For now, he remains held without bond, and the legal process continues to move slowly through motions, hearings, and evaluations. And even though the trial is still ahead, one thing is already clear: Keimani Latigue will not be forgotten. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.
Where's your daughter so we can check on her to make sure that she's okay?
Right now, I have nothing to say to you guys.
But that's not what I'm just asking
Okay,
where she is.
I have nothing to say.
The reward in the search for a little girl in New Hampshire is now $100,000. Manchester police and the FBI have been searching for Harmony Montgomery, the 7-year-old last seen 2 years ago, but only reported missing 2 weeks ago.
When the officers asked where his daughter was, Adam tried to convince them that everything was fine. "She's alive. I swear on my life." But Harmony Montgomery had already been missing for more than 2 years. 2 solid years. And behind that silence were months of unanswered messages, delayed welfare checks, and warnings that went nowhere. Child protection workers kept marking cases as closed, and while those warnings were being ignored, Adam and his wife were hiding a truth that investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing failures of care they had ever confronted. But what happened to Harmony Montgomery was not a sudden tragedy, and the way the truth eventually unfolded left the judge and the entire nation unable to sleep for days. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Harmony Montgomery entered the world on June 7, 2014, and from the beginning, her life pulled in 2 directions. She was born with partial blindness in her left eye, and doctors spent her first months trying to understand the extent of the impairment. Her mother, Crystal Sorey, wanted to be present for every update, but she was already struggling with addiction, and the instability around her made it difficult to care for a newborn who needed consistent medical attention. Within months, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families stepped in because the visits to Crystal's home kept revealing the same pattern: missed appointments, escalating drug use, and a living situation that shifted from one relative's home to another. So, DCYF removed Harmony from Crystal's custody, and so began a cycle that would shape most of Harmony's early childhood. She went into foster care for her safety, but the back and forth between placements, reunifications, and removals never allowed her to form the steady routines most infants grow into. However, the foster family in Haverhill, Massachusetts became the one stable point in her life. They cared for her through her medical evaluations and celebrated her developmental milestones, and they repeatedly told caseworkers they were willing to adopt her if that became possible. However, the plan kept changing whenever Crystal attempted to regain control of her life. She would complete part of a treatment program, and the agency would try transitioning Harmony back. Then Crystal would relapse, and Harmony would be returned to foster care again. But while all of that was happening, Harmony's father, Adam Montgomery, barely had a place in her story. He spent most of her first year in and out of prison, and so his involvement came down to state-approved supervised visits. The first one happened in January 2015, when Harmony was about 7 months old. He attended 5 visits in total, then stopped showing up without giving any reason. After that, his presence faded again, and Harmony's life returned to the same loop of foster homes, safety plans, and short reunifications. But the moment Adam suddenly re-entered Harmony's life, everything changed. Adam Montgomery's history stretched back long before Harmony was born, and the pattern that followed him into adulthood had already taken shape when he was still a teenager. He grew up moving between relatives, and by 16, police were already documenting incidents that involved weapons, intimidation, and sudden bursts of aggression. His first serious charge came after he was caught on school grounds with a dangerous weapon, and by 17, he had been charged with burglary and not long after that, he threatened an ex-girlfriend during a fight that escalated enough for neighbors to call the police. Each arrest came with probation conditions that he followed for a short time and then violated again. But that's not all. When he was still in his teens, he stabbed someone during a robbery attempt, and investigators later said the case stood out because of how quickly he resorted to violence when he felt cornered. However, you would think Adam might have changed in his 20s, but he didn't. He only grew worse. He began selling drugs, and he spent long stretches in prison for charges that involved weapons and his addiction worsened with every release. So each attempt at probation ended up back where it started. But the case that kept him locked up around the time Harmony was born came from a drug deal in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Adam arranged to buy substances, but when the seller arrived, he tried to rob him instead. The victim swatted at the weapon, Adam pulled the trigger, and the bullet went into the man's face. The victim survived, and Adam went to prison again. This was the man the system later decided was stable enough to take custody of a child. When Harmony was born in 2014, Adam was still incarcerated, and he remained there for most of her early life. He missed every medical evaluation, every hearing about her placement, and nearly all of the records from those years list him as not present or unable to contact. As mentioned earlier, the few supervised visits he attended came after his 2015 release, but even those only lasted for 5 sessions before he stopped showing up. So when the custody hearing came around in February 2019, the expectation was that Harmony would either remain with her foster family or be reunited with Crystal once she completed treatment. The hearing date was set, and both parents were supposed to appear, but the schedule created a conflict that changed the course of this entire case. Crystal had a simultaneous court appointment for a different child, and because she didn't make it to Harmony's hearing, the judge awarded Adam full custody. But this would soon prove to be a deadly mistake, one that would change the course of things forever. Even the foster family who had cared for Harmony for years and who offered to adopt her assumed the court would never place her with a father who had spent most of her life in prison. But the ruling stood, and within a week, Harmony was moved across state lines to Manchester, New Hampshire, where Adam was living with his wife, Kayla, and their 2 young sons. And once she arrived in that home, the warning signs began almost immediately. When Harmony moved into the Guilford Street home in February 2019, the small Manchester home had become crowded because Adam lived there with his wife, Kayla, and their 2 young sons. And for a brief period, members of Adam's extended family also stayed there. So, the combination of limited space, ongoing financial strain, and unresolved conflict created a living situation that caseworkers later described as chaotic from the moment Harmony arrived. The house itself carried its own set of problems. Neighbors would later tell investigators that the lights in the home often stayed off for long stretches, and reports from police calls showed that electricity was disconnected at least once during the year because the bills had not been paid. Adam kept a generator running outside the home so the refrigerator would not spoil, and he explained to officers that the family was managing fine, even though the inside of the house was cluttered with trash, food containers, and piles of clothing that made the space feel cramped and neglected. Caseworkers also documented that the children appeared fed, but they also noted the physical condition of the home, the lack of utilities, and the way every visit revealed some form of stress between Adam and Kayla. And there were also early concerns about drug use inside the household. Relatives later told investigators that Adam appeared to be slipping back into old habits, and Kayla admitted in later statements that Adam had relapsed sometime during the year. Neighbors reported frequent arguments coming from inside the house, and some described nights where shouting went on long enough for them to consider calling the police. But things escalated further when Adam's uncle, Kevin Montgomery, visited the home during the summer of 2019. He had come from Florida to spend time with the family, and he quickly noticed that Harmony seemed more withdrawn than the last time he had seen her. One afternoon, he saw a dark mark under her eye, and when he asked Adam what had happened, Adam responded with a casual confidence that left Kevin unsettled. According to Kevin's later statements to police, Adam looked at him and said he had bashed her around the house. Kevin said the tone of the admission made it clear Adam was not exaggerating. During the visit, Kevin also observed punishments that he felt crossed a line. He said he saw Adam force Harmony to scrub the toilet with her own toothbrush, and he described timeouts where she was made to stand in the corner for hours, sometimes long enough that she ended up wetting herself because she was not allowed to move. However, Kevin confronted Adam about the severity of the punishments, but the conversation went nowhere, and the atmosphere inside the home became tense until Kevin left Manchester and returned to Florida. Once he got home, Kevin struggled with what he had witnessed. He talked with family members, reviewed what he had seen, and eventually made an anonymous report to New Hampshire DCYF. In the call, he detailed the black eye, the punishments, the unstable environment, and his belief that Adam was slipping back into drug use. It was one of the earliest warnings that something inside the Guilford Street home was dangerously wrong, and when DCYF visited, but what they did next still remains one of the most criticized decisions in the state's history. DCYF became involved again in August 2019, and the visit was supposed to give clarity, but it only deepened the confusion. The worker noted a red mark under Harmony's eye, and Adam immediately blamed her younger siblings. He said they were roughhousing, and he repeated the story with so much confidence that the worker didn't push further. But the concerns didn't end there, because only 2 months later in October 2019, DCYF returned for another check. This time, the worker saw food in the fridge, saw the children running around, and described them as happy. Then January 2020 arrived, and this visit became the most consequential failure of them all. When DCYF knocked on the door, Harmony wasn't there. Adam said she was with her mother, and he delivered the line casually, as if it were routine. No one asked for proof. No one drove to Crystal's address or even a face-to-face confirmation. The worker simply noted Adam's statement and moved on, unaware that Crystal had already been trying for months to reach her daughter and had never received a single call from DCYF. Crystal later said she kept checking her phone because she was desperate for information, and she never understood why no one from the agency called her directly. The last confirmed sighting of Harmony Montgomery happened in October 2019, when officers responded to a call at the family's home on Guilford Street. And a month later, in November 2019, the Montgomery family was evicted from that same address. The house that had already raised concern for poor living conditions and instability was now empty, and what followed pushed the family into an even more fragile state. They began living in their car, squeezing Adam, Kayla, their 2 younger sons, and Harmony into the cramped space as winter approached. Kayla later explained that during the Thanksgiving weekend of 2019, Adam drove her to work with Harmony sitting quietly in the back seat. She mentioned that the car was unusually tense that morning, and she also remembered Harmony staying silent, which was rare for a little girl who usually tried to stay close to the adults in the car. But Kayla didn't question it. She stepped out, went inside, and assumed Adam would return later with all the children exactly as he always did. But when Adam came back to pick her up, Harmony wasn't there. Kayla said he acted like nothing was wrong. He told her that he had dropped Harmony off with Crystal, her biological mother, and that she would be staying with her indefinitely. Adam repeated the same line for months. Harmony was with Crystal and to relatives, and when DCYF eventually knocked on his door in January 2020 asking where Harmony was, he said it again with the same confidence he had used with everyone else. However, there was a problem so large that it shattered every version of Adam's story in an instant. Crystal hadn't seen her daughter since April 2019. But the silence surrounding Harmony Montgomery stretched slowly over 20 months, and every week inside that gap became harder to explain. Crystal Sorey, Harmony's mother, began reaching out to Adam again early in 2020 because she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She called him repeatedly, but each attempt ended the same way. Adam ignored the messages first, then blocked her number completely, and she could no longer reach her daughter or anyone inside his home. So Crystal tried a different approach. She called Harmony's former daycare, she called multiple schools in the Manchester area, she called hospitals and left her name with front desk staff, hoping her daughter's name might appear in a system somewhere. When that failed, she contacted DCYF again and again, hoping someone inside the agency would check on Harmony directly. And when the calls didn't bring answers, she turned to the police because she believed something had happened and no one was listening.
It wasn't her voice, or I couldn't be, or nobody could hear me. You know, I just want people to hear me and come forward and tell us something, because somebody knows something. It's a fact. Like, someone knows something. And either they're too afraid to get in trouble or whatever, but someone knows something.
But Crystal wasn't the only person who lost contact with the Montgomery household. Adam's relatives also stopped hearing from him. The same family members who had visited Guilford Street earlier that year and raised concerns about Harmony now said they hadn't seen her, hadn't spoken to her, and had no idea where Adam had taken her. It was as if she had vanished, and somehow no system, family, school, welfare, or medical, noticed her absence. And while all this was happening, Kayla continued collecting Harmony's food stamp benefits every month. For nearly 2 years, she processed them as if Harmony was still living under the same roof, and the state continued issuing those benefits because no one realized Harmony was missing. The paperwork went through, the system approved it, and the family used the funds while Harmony's name stayed active inside state databases. And still, no one asked why a little girl receiving state assistance hadn't been enrolled in school. There were no first grade records, no doctor visits, and no updated forms. And by the end of 2021, Crystal had spent nearly 2 years trying to get someone to help her find her daughter. So on December 29th, 2021, she decided to send a direct email to the mayor of Manchester. It was a short message, but it carried the weight of everything she had been living with. She wrote that Harmony was missing, that she was unsafe, and that no one had been able to tell her where her daughter was supposed to be. Crystal explained that she had not seen Harmony since April 2019, and that every effort she made to reach Adam ended with blocked calls, unanswered messages, or vague claims she knew were not true. The urgency in her words forced immediate attention, and within hours the mayor's office contacted the Manchester Police Department. Detectives pulled Harmony's name from state databases and realized how little information existed after 2019, and the moment investigators recognized that gap, they launched a full missing child investigation. So on December 31st, 2021, the Manchester Police Department made the case public. They announced that 7-year-old Harmony Montgomery had not been seen since late 2019, and that they needed the community's help to find her. The announcement spread quickly because the timeline alone made people stop. A child had been missing for 2 years before anyone officially noticed.
Solid leads. The reward in the search for a little girl in New Hampshire is now $100,000. Manchester police and the FBI have been searching for Harmony Montgomery, the 7-year-old last seen 2 years ago, but only reported missing 2 weeks ago. Police were at...
And only 2 hours after that announcement went out, officers found Adam Montgomery asleep inside a parked car. When officers found Adam Montgomery on the night of December 31st, 2021, he was asleep inside a parked car with his new girlfriend, Kesley Small, in the passenger seat. The officers explained that they needed to check on Harmony and that they simply wanted to know where she was. But Adam stood still and repeated the same line again and again. "I have nothing to say."
Last time you saw her alive. You know that she's fine. Like, you can assure me that she's alive.
I know she's fine. All right, look, I have nothing else to say, guys. I really don't. I have nothing else to say to you guys.
But you can tell me, like, Dad, you can look me right in the eye and tell me that she's alive.
She's alive.
You know for a fact.
I have nothing else to say.
Okay. And when's the last time you saw her alive?
All right, I have nothing else to say.
But Adam, without question, you see where our concern is at. You get what I'm saying?
If nobody, dude, if nobody has seen her in like 2 years, they're saying, like, alive. Like, I talked to your family. Nobody's even seen her either. Your family. I know they're all down in Florida. They're concerned too, man. Like, I talked to, like, your brother, talked to your uncle, grandma. We talked to a lot of people, man. I'm not just around and just like, all right. So, like, you understand, like, people stopped you. Like, they had us come out from the office, like, all right. Like, I need to know that you saw your daughter alive recently. Did you see her? Have you seen her last time?
Recently.
Why not? You're her dad. You love your kids, right?
Yeah.
So why didn't you see your kid?
I haven't been around here, man. I've been in Maine.
But when they asked him the last time he saw Harmony alive, he couldn't answer that, but insisted that she's definitely with Crystal. Then the officers tried a different angle and reminded him that he had been given legal custody of Harmony, meaning he had every right to tell them where she was without fear of losing her. They asked why he would hide that information if the child was safe, but Adam kept repeating variations of the same refusal. His only answer was, "Go talk to Crystal." But detectives already had, and Crystal had told them she had not seen her daughter since April 2019. So, Adam Montgomery was taken into custody 4 days after the body cam encounter, but he wasn't brought in on homicide charges. Detectives arrested him on older assault and indictment counts tied to the 2019 incident when Harmony had been seen with a black eye. He responded as if he had no idea what the officers were talking about, not knowing that his brother had already confessed to police about the black eye.
After his arrest on January the 4th of 2022, investigators interviewed Adam and again tried to find out where Harmony was. During his interview, Adam made multiple contradictory statements. One of those contradictory statements was in relation to Harmony's black eye. Adam's uncle had told police about Harmony's black eye, the same black eye that Adam told social workers was caused by one of Harmony's siblings. During his interview with police, Adam said he knew nothing about any injuries to Harmony.
Well, your daughter had some injuries that you know about when you lived on Guilford Street.
No, I do not. What are you referring to?
Well, you were there, I wasn't, right?
What are you referring to?
I'm referring to her having some good marks.
What are you referring to?
Marks that were left on her by you.
Absolutely not. I have nothing else to say. You're sitting there telling me that right off the rip that there was something wrong with my daughter because of me. No, that's bullshit.
Okay. So if your daughter had marks on her at some point when you lived over there.
It sounded convincing on the surface, but DCYF never should have closed the case, especially with his criminal history in plain view.
Your daughter had a mark on her face that people, multiple people, have told us was inflicted by you.
Multiple people that weren't even living with us at the time.
Well,
when asked why the DCYF began checking up on Adam's family, he told investigators that his uncle, Kevin, told them that he was using drugs. But then later, he changes his story.
You don't recall your daughter ever having a mark on her face?
The reason DCYF came out to visit you guys, you don't recall that? Why did DCYF come out and start visiting you guys? What was the allegation?
If I remember correctly, it was because of, I believe at the time, I could be wrong, I believe it had something to do with my uncle saying I was using drugs, and I wasn't.
Now, who's your uncle so we are clear?
Kevin.
Okay. And Kevin's last name?
Montgomery. Oh, That's what it was. That's what it was due. That's what it was due to. So Kevin moved out because between me and my wife and Kevin, we were supposed to like pay the bills, keep the heat on, the gas on, whatever. Well, Kevin was supposed to pay the electric bill. He didn't pay the electric bill. Me and my wife, I picked my wife from work and showed up at home. They were shutting the electricity off. So me and Kevin got into an argument about not paying the bill. Yeah. And he took his shit and moved out. And then so the next day, DCY, or 2 days later, something like that, I don't know, DCYF showed up and the police showed up because they said that we were unfit to have the children at the house because there was no electricity in the house. Okay. But we had a generator running, we had the fridge hooked up to it, there was food in the fridge, everything.
So the officers asked him one last time to confirm whether Harmony was alive, but he wasn't talking anymore. Then he ended the conversation with the final statement detectives had been expecting: "I want my lawyer." And the interview stopped there, but investigators were about to confront another person who might know the truth: Kayla Montgomery. Kayla Montgomery's first version of events sounded calm and practiced. She told detectives that the last time she saw Harmony alive was sometime around November 2019 during a morning drive. She said Adam had taken her to work and Harmony was in the back seat. According to her, Adam dropped her off, promised to take Harmony to Crystal, and came home later that day saying the handoff was complete. It was a simple story, and she repeated it every time detectives asked. But detectives didn't take anything at face value, so they pulled her employment records to confirm the shift she claimed she worked that day. And that was when the first crack appeared. She wasn't working there anymore. In fact, she had left the job more than a week before the date she insisted she last saw Harmony. That one contradiction changed everything, because it showed investigators that Kayla wasn't just confused, she was lying. So they looked deeper, and another issue surfaced. For nearly 2 years, she continued collecting food stamp benefits for Harmony even though she claimed the child wasn't living with them. That discovery led to her arrest on welfare fraud charges, and it forced Kayla into a corner she could no longer talk her way out of. Then, for the first time, she stopped repeating the story she had been holding on to for years. She admitted that Adam never took Harmony to Crystal, and she said that Harmony never left that car alive. She said Adam unalived her, and she described a moment that detectives knew would change the entire direction of the case. And yet, they had no idea just how disturbing her testimony would become. According to Kayla Montgomery, everything began on the morning of December 7th, 2019. The family had been living out of their car after the eviction, and mornings often started the same way. Adam driving to the methadone clinic, Kayla in the passenger seat, and the children in the back, including 5-year-old Harmony. It was cold, early, and everyone was tired. Harmony also struggled with bladder control, something that had become more frequent during the period of homelessness, and something Adam grew increasingly impatient about. Kayla said Harmony had another accident that morning, and she remembered how quickly Adam's mood shifted as he was repeatedly punching Harmony. At this time, 2 other children were in the same car with them. She described moments when she tried to speak up but stopped because of the look Adam gave her. A look she said frightened her more than anything she'd seen from him before. But she didn't check on Harmony, and she didn't say anything, and at some point, he pulled a blanket over Harmony, telling her to stay calm, and Kayla said she didn't know what to say or how to react. She only knew something was very wrong. But instead of calling for help, they drove to Burger King because the 2 younger boys were hungry, and Adam insisted they needed food. Kayla said she watched him walk inside while Harmony remained under the blanket in the back seat, and she stayed quiet because she didn't know what else to do. After that, they drove back to Colonial Village, the apartment complex where they often parked to meet people or rest. Kayla remembered the moment Adam opened the back door and reached under the blanket to shake Harmony gently, trying to wake her, but she didn't respond. He tried again, and the stillness confirmed what neither of them wanted to say out loud. That was when Kayla understood that Harmony was gone, and every decision they made from that moment moved them further away from help and deeper into something neither of them could undo. And instead of calling for help, they made a series of decisions that would horrify investigators. Kayla told investigators that after Adam realized Harmony was gone, he pulled a red duffel bag from the trunk and placed her inside.
Harmony passed away.
Well,
Adam was trying to wake her up and she didn't reply or anything. He took the duffel bag that was in the trunk and put her in the duffel bag.
The parking lot was quiet and the snow was piled high along the edges, so he tucked the bag into a snowbank beside the car, hoping the cold would slow everything down and keep attention away.
In the snowbank, so Anthony wouldn't see it.
Where was the snowbank that you put? And sorry, let me clarify. Who put her in a snowbank?
Adam.
Where was that snowbank that he put her in?
In the embankment from the parking lot.
But they couldn't leave it there for long, so when they left the car and went to stay at Kayla's mother's apartment, Adam carried the duffel bag with him. The building had a shared hallway on her mother's floor, and someone had left a large cooler sitting near the entrance. Adam opened it, lowered the duffel bag inside, and closed the lid.
The hall walkway that the residents used to get in and out of the building, and it was on my mom's floor level in the hallway. And he put the he put the duffel bag in the cooler.
And what was in the duffel bag at that point?
Harmony.
So he removed her from the trash and he put her in this cooler.
Yes.
It sat there for weeks, and every resident who used the hallway walked right past it, unaware of what Adam had hidden inside. Then the family moved again, this time to a shelter. It was crowded, and people came and went at all hours of the day, so Adam had to find somewhere new to put the bag. Kayla said he climbed onto a chair in their small room and pushed it into the ceiling vent, hoping it would stay out of sight. For a while, no one questioned anything, but the smell eventually grew noticeable enough that another resident reported it to maintenance.
In the ceiling. In the vent of the room that we stayed in.
At the time you were living at the Families in Transition shelter, was there anything going on with Harmony's body?
You could smell a horrible smell that was coming through the vents.
And when maintenance workers started checking each room, Adam grabbed the bag and moved it into the bathroom, waiting silently as they inspected the ceiling. They left without finding anything, and the odor was blamed on a dead animal that had somehow ended up in the ducts. So the family moved again, this time into a small apartment, and Adam placed the bag in a bedroom closet. Kayla said he barely spoke during this period and seemed focused only on figuring out what to do next.
Asked me to bring the bag to his job because he told me that he put her in the freezer.
Then, in March 2020, Adam rented a truck. Kayla remembered the exact night because he left the apartment around 1 a.m. while the children were asleep. He carried the bag with him, closed the door behind him, and drove off without saying where he was going. She stayed awake until he returned 4 hours later, and she noticed immediately that he no longer had the bag. He didn't explain what he had done or where he had gone. He simply walked into the apartment, sat down, and said nothing else about it. And from that moment on, Harmony was never seen again. Once Kayla finally admitted that Harmony hadn't been seen since late 2019, the investigation expanded far beyond Manchester. The FBI joined the case almost immediately. Agents reviewed every address the family had lived in, every shelter they passed through, and every vehicle they used, and they worked alongside local detectives to retrace steps that were now nearly 2 years old. Their first major focus was the old house on Guilford Street. It had been empty for a long time, but investigators believed it still held answers. So they sealed off the backyard, set up floodlights, and began a full excavation. Neighbors stood outside watching as crews dug through the frozen earth, piece by piece, searching for anything that could anchor the story Kayla had begun to tell. Inside the house, detectives paid close attention to the basement and the kitchen. From the kitchen, they seized a refrigerator door, believing it might contain trace evidence connected to Adam's movements during the months after Harmony vanished. And they brought in specially trained cadaver dogs that swept through the basement, hallways, and common spaces, reacting strongly in key areas investigators later confirmed were linked to decomposition. DNA testing soon supported what detectives feared. Although no remains were recovered, the biological evidence found at multiple locations aligned with the timeline Kayla described. And by August 2022, after months of searching, reviewing forensic reports, and analyzing surveillance and cell site records, the Attorney General announced that Harmony was presumed dead. It was a heartbreaking declaration, but the case wasn't over. The trial opened in February 2024, and from the very first day, it carried a weight that everyone in the courtroom could feel. Kayla took the stand almost immediately. She had already accepted a plea agreement that required her to testify truthfully, and she walked into the courtroom knowing the entire case now depended on whether the jury believed her. And every part of her timeline, every location, every movement, every moment of fear matched the evidence investigators had collected over the previous 2 years. Prosecutors reinforced her testimony with forensic findings. They introduced the biological traces recovered from several addresses, and they presented the cell site records that tracked Adam's late-night drive in March 2020, the same night Kayla said he left with the duffel bag and returned without it. They also showed how both Adam and Kayla continued collecting benefits for Harmony long after she disappeared, using that evidence to highlight the lies Adam repeated each time someone asked where his daughter was. And then the prosecutors turned to Adam's own contradictions. They replayed his body cam encounter with officers, his shifting stories in the interview room, and the moments when he insisted Harmony was alive, even though he couldn't say where she was or when he had last seen her. So, Adam Montgomery was found guilty of second-degree witness tampering, falsifying physical evidence, and the abuse of a corpse. The court sentenced him to a minimum of 56 years in prison, a term long enough to ensure he would never walk free again. And while Adam faced a lifetime in prison, the court also had to address the role of Kayla Montgomery, the one person who had lived beside Harmony, witnessed the events of December 2019, and stayed silent for years. Kayla had entered a plea agreement long before Adam's murder trial began, and her cooperation came with a difficult trade-off. She admitted to perjury and welfare fraud, and she accepted responsibility for repeatedly lying about Harmony's whereabouts. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 18 months in state prison. It was a relatively short sentence, shaped largely by the plea deal that required her to testify truthfully against Adam. But her sentencing did not sit well with everyone, and the reaction outside the courtroom was far more complicated. Harmony's mother, Crystal Sorey, made it clear that she did not believe Kayla's punishment matched the depth of her involvement. She felt that Kayla had lived in the same home, watched Adam mistreat Harmony, and continued deceiving authorities long after the child was gone. Crystal struggled to accept a sentence that allowed Kayla to walk free in less than 2 years. And while Adam would spend the rest of his life behind bars, Kayla's role remained one of the most painful and controversial parts of the story. So what do you think about this case? What do you believe could have been done to prevent tragedies like this from happening again and again? Share your thoughts in the comments section. We read every single one. Our heartfelt condolences go to Harmony's family, especially her mother, who fought for answers when no one listened. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. The helicopter hovered low over the dense forest of Embu-Guasu. Thousands of flyers drifted down, scattering across the ground. Each one carried the faces of Liana Bay Friedenbach, 16 years old, and Felipe Silva Cafe, 19, 2 students who had left Sao Paulo for a quiet weekend and never came back. Below, Liana's father, Ari Friedenbach, stood among police officers and search teams. Days had passed, phones were dead, and stories no longer matched, and the harder it became to believe this was just a case of 2 teenagers lost in unfamiliar terrain. As officers retraced paths through abandoned farms and narrow trails, 2 names kept resurfacing, names locals associated with these woods and with fear. And by the time the truth surfaced, one of the teens was already dead, and the other would soon meet the same fate. This is the story of 2 young students who disappeared into the woods of Embu-Guasu and were held captive for days by a group of 5. What followed would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Brazilian history. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Liana Bay Friedenbach grew up in Sao Paulo in a home where structure, trust, and routine quietly shaped her everyday life. And from an early age, she was surrounded by a sense of stability that made her feel protected and understood. She lived with her parents and her younger brother in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, and inside that home, conversations were open, expectations were clear, and affection was constant but never suffocating. Her father, Ari Friedenbach, worked as a lawyer, and her mother managed the household, creating an environment where discipline and care existed side by side. Liana was especially close to her father, and that bond stood out to everyone who knew them, because it was built on trust rather than control. Ari knew her routines, her habits, and the rhythm of her days, and Liana, in return, was used to explaining where she was going, who she would be with, and when she planned to return. It was not something she felt forced to do, but something that came naturally, because their relationship worked on honesty, and that honesty had never really been tested before. Ari often drove her to the bus stop for school activities, the gym, or youth programs. And over time, those small routines became part of how he measured normalcy, because as long as they stayed intact, everything felt right. Faith and discipline played a quiet but important role in Liana's life, and she was actively involved in her religious community, attending youth programs and social activities that gave her a strong sense of belonging. She cared about her health and took fitness seriously, spending time at the gym and paying attention to her well-being, not out of pressure, but because it made her feel balanced. She also had a distinct personal style, dressing in dark clothing, listening to rock music, and wearing accessories that set her apart from her peers. Education mattered in the Friedenbach household, and Liana treated it with the same seriousness she brought to other parts of her life. She was thoughtful about how she learned best, and after discussing it with her parents, she decided to switch to night classes, believing she retained information better in the evenings. In August 2003, her parents transferred her to Colegio São Luís, one of the most respected private schools in São Paulo, not because there was a problem where she had been, but because they wanted to place her in an environment that would challenge her academically and open more doors in the future. Joining a new school in the middle of the semester was not easy, and at first Liana struggled to adjust, but she adapted quickly, found her footing, and settled into her routine. By 16, Liana was already thinking ahead, and she spoke openly about her plans for the future, including her interest in studying physical education and eventually attending university. She had begun preparing for the FUVEST exam, even though she was still young, because planning early felt natural to her, and those close to her saw it as another sign of how grounded she was. Nothing about her life suggested recklessness or secrecy, and if anything, her parents believed they knew their daughter well, because up until that point, she had given them every reason to feel that way. Then at 16, Liana fell in love for the first time, and that was where everything changed. Felipe Silva Cafe came from a background that was quieter and more modest than Liana's, but it was one that shaped him into someone deeply focused and deliberate, and those who knew him often described him as a young man who carried responsibility naturally without needing to announce it. Felipe attended Colegio São Luís as a scholarship student, and that fact mattered because it meant he had secured his place through effort and consistency, not family connections or privilege. During the day, he worked, balancing jobs that helped support himself and ease the financial weight on his family. And then at night, he studied, often arriving at school already tired but never disengaged. He talked about his ambitions, especially his interest in studying law and eventually joining the police force. When Felipe met Liana, the connection did not arrive with drama or grand gestures, but developed naturally through small conversations and shared moments in school spaces where students gathered between classes. Liana was new, dressed differently from most of her peers, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that stood out, and Felipe noticed her almost immediately. Friends later said that the two seemed comfortable around each other from the beginning. Felipe treated Liana with care, and that detail did not go unnoticed, especially by her father. One afternoon, Ari Friedenbach arrived at the school to pick up his daughter, and as Liana walked toward the car, Felipe accompanied her all the way to the door before turning back. Ari watched the interaction closely, then asked almost casually, "Is that your boyfriend?" And Liana smiled before answering, "Not yet." The next day, the same routine repeated itself, Felipe walking her to the car again, and this time, when Liana got in, she looked at her father and said, "Guess what? He's my boyfriend now." Ari was pleased to see his daughter happy, and although he did not yet know Felipe well, he chose not to interfere or push too hard, trusting that Liana's judgment had always guided her well. For Liana, this relationship marked her first experience with love, and for Felipe, it felt like something he approached with seriousness rather than excitement alone. Over the next 2 months, from August into September 2003, they grew closer, spending time together when they could, sharing plans, and even exchanging promise rings. But after 2 months together, they made a decision that changed everything. The idea of the trip did not begin as something secret or reckless, and at first, it sounded like nothing more than a simple plan to spend a weekend away from the city. Felipe had been to Embu Guasu before with friends, and in his mind, it was a place where they camped, cooked together, and escaped the pressure of school and work for a short time. And when he mentioned it to Liana, she listened with interest rather than hesitation. Initially, the plan involved other people. Felipe's friends were supposed to go with them, and that detail mattered because the trip was never imagined as a private escape for just the two of them. But as the days passed, those plans began to fall apart quietly. One friend backed out because of work, another because of family obligations, and then another simply stopped responding. And with each withdrawal, the group grew smaller until there were no friends left to go at all. At that point, Felipe still wanted to make the trip, and Liana wanted to spend time with him. They talked it through, considered the options, and then agreed to go alone, believing that nothing about the trip itself had changed except the number of people attending. To them, it was still a short camping getaway, something they would return from with stories and photos, not something that needed to be questioned too deeply. So, Felipe told his parents that he was going camping with friends, which was not unusual for him, and did not raise concern, because he had done similar things before. Liana, however, knew that her situation was different because her parents were more protective, especially when it came to places she had never been and people they did not know well. She understood that asking directly would lead to a refusal, so instead, she constructed a version of the weekend that sounded safe, familiar, and entirely supervised. She told her parents that she would be spending Friday night with her youth group and then leaving early the next morning for a trip to Ilhabala, a destination she had visited before and one her father would not question. She explained that the group would be traveling together, that adults would be present, and that everything had already been arranged. And because this explanation aligned perfectly with her usual activities, it did not trigger suspicion. She even mentioned that she would not need a ride to the bus stop, saying Felipe would walk her there, something that had already become routine. And in doing so, she removed the final detail that might have felt out of place. But what they did not know was that Embu Guasu watched outsiders closely. On Friday, October 31st, 2003, the school day ended like any other, and from the outside, nothing about that afternoon hinted at what was already unfolding beneath the surface. When classes at Colegio San Luis finished, Liana did not head home, and instead, she met Felipe just beyond the school gates, both of them carrying backpacks that held everything they believed they would need for the weekend. They could not go home because doing so would unravel the story Liana had told her parents, and they could not travel into the countryside right away either, because buses toward the rural outskirts of São Paulo did not resume until early morning. So they went downtown, blending into the noise and movement of São Paulo, and eventually settled beneath the wide concrete span of the Museum of Art of São Paulo, the MASP, a place that often became an informal gathering spot late at night. Liana checked her phone occasionally, careful not to call anyone who might ask questions, and Felipe kept track of the time, waiting for the moment when buses would begin running again. And, as the first light of morning spread across the city, they gathered their things, stood up from the bench, and made their way toward the transit lines that would take them out of São Paulo and into unfamiliar territory. When the bus finally pulled into Embu Guasu, the change was immediate. The noise and movement of São Paulo faded behind them, replaced by quieter streets, fewer people, and a sense that everything moved at a different pace. Liana and Felipe stepped off at the terminal with their backpacks, looking around as if to orient themselves. From there, they made their way towards Santa Rita, a small village near the rural area where they planned to camp, and as they moved farther from the terminal, the surroundings grew more sparse. Houses were spaced farther apart, roads became narrower, and conversations dropped to a low murmur, because even without anyone saying it out loud, both of them could feel that they were no longer just visitors passing through a busy place. They stood out as two young people from the city carrying large backpacks into an area that was not used to seeing them. Then they took a taxi to go deeper into the countryside, asking to be dropped off near a dirt road that led toward the area Felipe remembered from previous trips. And once the car disappeared down the road, Liana and Felipe were left alone with the landscape. From that point on, there were no more vehicles, no crowds, and no easy way back. They began walking the remaining 4.5 kilometers, following the path toward an abandoned farm Felipe believed would offer privacy and shelter. As they moved farther along the trail, the signs of abandonment became clearer. Fences leaned at odd angles, vegetation crept over old structures, and eventually, the outline of the farm appeared, its walls worn down by time and neglect. The house itself was clearly unused, windows broken, surfaces marked by years of exposure, and yet, to the couple, it still felt like a suitable spot, isolated enough to avoid interruption and close enough to the trail to find again if they needed to leave. It was on that walk, before they reached the farm, that they passed two men coming from the opposite direction. The encounter was brief and unremarkable from Liana and Felipe's perspective, just a quick glance as they stepped aside on the narrow path. But the reaction on the other side was different. The two men, Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known locally as Champina, and Paulo Cesar da Silva Marquez, known as Pernambuco, noticed them immediately, taking in the backpacks, the city clothes, and Liana's presence. They stopped and watched as the couple walked away, disappearing down the trail toward the abandoned farm. And from that moment on, Liana and Felipe were no longer just two teenagers on a camping trip. As night settled over the abandoned farm, the forest around Liana and Felipe grew quieter. They finished setting up the tent beneath the weakened roof structure nearby, trying to make the space feel temporary and safe, and for a short moment, it almost worked. But before they went to sleep, Liana's phone rang. It was her father, Ari Friedenbach, calling to check in, just as he always did. She answered calmly, keeping her voice steady, but Ari immediately noticed something that did not sit right with him. The background was quiet. Too quiet for a bus full of young people heading out on a group trip, and there was no laughter, no chatter, none of the usual sounds he expected to hear. He asked her about it, and Liana responded quickly, saying they had left very early and that most people were asleep, and on its own it did not raise alarm, so Ari accepted it, then asked her to promise she would call again once she arrived at her destination. Liana agreed and the call ended, leaving Ari with a faint unease he could not yet explain. Not long after, Liana and Felipe lay down inside the tent. They believed they were alone, and with no reason to think otherwise, sleep came quickly. But at some point in the darkness, that sense of isolation broke. The attack happened suddenly and without warning. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champina, and Paulo Cesar da Silva Marquez, known as Pernambuco, approached the tent under the cover of darkness, having already watched the couple earlier that day. Pernambuco moved first, using a knife to slice through the side of the tent, creating an opening large enough to force his way inside, while Champina stood close, ready to control whoever came out. As the fabric tore open, both men shouted orders immediately, telling Felipe Silva Cafe and Liana Bay Friedenbach not to scream and not to move. Felipe reacted first, trying to sit up, but Pernambuco grabbed him and dragged him out of the tent, forcing him to the ground before he could understand what was happening. Champina turned to Liana, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from Felipe, stopping her when she tried to reach him. Felipe shouted Liana's name, and she answered him, but their voices were cut short as the men separated them, pushing Felipe several steps away and keeping Liana behind. Pernambuco ordered Felipe to stay quiet and keep his head down, while Champina warned Liana not to resist. Champina and Pernambuco then restrained both of them, covering their eyes so they could no longer see where they were being taken. With their vision gone, the sense of place disappeared instantly. They forced the couple to walk away from the campsite, deeper into the forest, but the tent, their backpacks, and their personal belongings remained behind, exactly where they had been left, untouched. This shows that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong, but a deliberate attack on the couple. From that moment on, Liana Bay Friedenbach and Felipe Silva Cafe were no longer on a camping trip, they were captives. Champina and Pernambuco forced Liana and Felipe into a small house hidden deep in the rural area, a place that belonged to Antonio Caetano da Silva, and from the moment they entered, the situation escalated from kidnapping to prolonged captivity. Champina immediately pulled Liana away from Felipe, shutting her into a separate room, while Paulo Cesar da Silva Marquez, known as Pernambuco, restrained Felipe and forced him to remain seated and silent. The separation was deliberate, and it removed any possibility that Felipe could protect her or intervene. Pernambuco tied Felipe to a chair and stayed close, watching him constantly, and every time Felipe tried to move or speak, Pernambuco warned him to stay quiet. Felipe could hear voices moving through the house and could hear Liana at times, and that awareness became its own form of torment because he understood that something was happening to her and that he had no way to stop it. Inside the other room, Champigna began Liana. The attacks did not happen once and end, but continued over several hours, stretching through the night, while Liana remained trapped in the house with no ability to escape. She had never had relations before, as she was a virgin before the assault occurred. At the time, however, that reality only intensified the trauma because everything she experienced in that house happened without consent and without any sense of when it would stop. Despite what she was enduring, Liana tried to regain some control by speaking when she could. She told Champigna and Pernambuco that her family had money and that her father, Ari Friedenbach, was a lawyer, and she suggested that they could demand a ransom in exchange for letting her go, hoping that money might redirect their actions and give them a reason to keep her alive. The suggestion was discussed briefly, but it never became a real plan because the men did not treat her words as a negotiation, only as information. But that's not all. Pernambuco argued that Felipe could not be released because he could identify them and report everything to the police. And Champigna agreed, dismissing the idea of ransom and focusing instead on eliminating risks. No one spoke about releasing both of them, and no one spoke about letting the situation end peacefully. And from that point forward, Felipe was no longer viewed as a hostage, but as a liability. Later that night, Antonio Caetano arrived at the house. Instead of stopping what was happening or intervening, he accepted the situation and became part of the group, reinforcing the sense that the crimes unfolding there were not impulsive mistakes, but choices being repeated and normalized. His presence extended the duration of the captivity and confirmed that no one inside that house intended to call for help or change course. As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook both teenagers. Liana remained awake out of fear and necessity, because sleep offered no safety, while Felipe stayed restrained, drained physically and emotionally by what he could hear and what he could not do. And by the next day, the group decided Felipe could not stay alive. But before that, Champigna, Pernambuco, and Antonio Caetano moved Liana and Felipe again the following day, November 2nd, 2003, taking them farther into the rural area and bringing them to a second house owned by Antonio Matias de Barros, a location even more isolated than the first. Champigna continued to subject Liana to SA, and this time the did not happen in isolation. Another man arrived at the house. His name was Agnaldo Pires, an adult associate of the group. He arrived knowing that a teenage girl was being held there against her will, and instead of leaving or intervening, he chose to stay. After his arrival, Agnaldo Pires also carried out SA against Liana, further extending the duration of her captivity and suffering. But when Antonio Matias, the house owner, came around, he did not carry out SA himself, but he knowingly allowed his house to be used for Liana's continued confinement and to make matters worse, the teens were not fed during this time. During this period, Champigna repeatedly presented Liana as his girlfriend whenever anyone was present, a lie he used to reduce suspicion and maintain control. When Champigna's brother came to the house looking for him, concerned because their mother did not know where he was, Champigna introduced Liana as his girlfriend once again. By the third day of captivity, Champigna and Pernambuco took Felipe out of Antonio Matias de Barros' house and led him into the woods, choosing a narrow trail that cut away from the property and disappeared into dense vegetation. They told him to keep walking, and they did not explain where they were going, because by then, explanations were no longer necessary. Liana stayed behind with the others, but close enough to sense that something final was unfolding. Then the sound came. It was a single gunshot, breaking through the quiet of the woods. Liana froze where she stood, because she understood immediately what it meant, even before anyone confirmed it. She asked where Felipe was, and she asked what they had done to him. Champigna answered without hesitation and without emotion. He told her, he's free. Liana understood that free did not mean released, and it did not mean escape. It meant Felipe was gone, and it meant she was now alone among people who had already proven what they were capable of doing. By Saturday evening, Ari Friedenbach expected to hear from his daughter again. Liana had promised to call, and although the trip itself had already felt rushed, he told himself there was no reason to panic. But the hours passed and the call never came. He tried her phone that afternoon, then again in the evening, and each time it rang unanswered. Eventually, the calls went straight to voicemail. At first, Ari chose not to panic. He did not want to alarm Liana's mother unnecessarily, and he told himself that poor reception or a busy schedule could explain the silence. Still, that last conversation replayed in his mind. The quiet background noise on the bus, the way Liana had rushed the call, the strange feeling that something had been left unsaid. By Sunday, concern turned into fear. It had been 2 full days with no contact. Ari called again and again, and every attempt went unanswered. Liana's mother began calling as well, and when neither of them could reach her, Ari decided to stop guessing and start asking questions. He opened Liana's phone book and called one of her closest friends, asking directly where she was. At first, the friend denied knowing anything, but when Ari explained how long Liana had been unreachable and how serious the situation had become, the truth came out. Liana had not gone to Ilabela with a youth group. She had gone away with Felipe Silva Cafe. That was the moment everything snapped into place. Ari did not wait. He got into his car with a friend and drove straight to Embu-Guasu, the last confirmed location anyone could give him. They searched on their own, driving through back roads and small neighborhoods long after nightfall, stopping people, asking questions, calling Liana's name into the dark. No one had answers. No one had seen the 2 teenagers with backpacks. By Monday morning, the police had been notified, and officers immediately treated the situation as a possible abduction. In Embu-Guasu, patrols spread across rural roads, questioning drivers, caretakers, and locals who knew the dangers of the region. Ari stayed close, following every development, printing flyers himself and handing them out to anyone who would take one. He called everyone he knew who might have connections or influence, refusing to sit still while time slipped away. A local businessman offered the use of a helicopter, and Ari accepted without hesitation. As the helicopter flew low over the forest, thousands of flyers carrying Liana's and Felipe's faces rained down over trees, dirt paths, and open clearings. Ari watched from below, knowing deep down that this was no longer a routine search. Something was very wrong. With 2 local officers guiding him, Ari later headed down a narrow dirt track toward an abandoned farm, a place locals avoided and rarely spoke about. Officers believed the area needed to be checked precisely because people stayed away from it. Ari walked with them through overgrown paths until he suddenly stopped. There was a tent. At first he hoped it was not theirs, but as he stepped closer, he saw Liana's flip-flops lying outside in the dirt, the same pair she wore almost every morning. The officers opened the tent, and the scene inside removed any doubt. A long knife slash ran down the side of the fabric. Inside, the bags were untouched, food still packed, nothing stolen, nothing disturbed except for the fact that the teenagers were gone. This was not 2 teens wandering off. One of the officers said it quietly, almost under his breath. He said it had Champigna's mark all over it. It was the first time Ari had heard the name. The suspicion was not random. The moment officers learned where the couple had disappeared, the same name surfaced again and again. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known locally as Champigna, was feared in that region for all the wrong reasons. Word on the street said he had already and killed someone at the age of 14. He roamed those forests constantly, lingered around abandoned properties, and had a history of approaching outsiders who passed through the area. Every disturbance, every violent incident in that part of Embu-Guasu seemed to circle back to him or his group. The officer riding with Ari had lived in the area for years. He knew the pattern, he knew the names, and when he heard about a young couple vanishing in those woods, he did not hesitate. This was exactly the kind of situation Champigna was known for. The manhunt began. Later that night, as the search intensified, Ari received a phone call. The man on the other end introduced himself only as a woodsman, someone who knew the forest better than anyone else. He had heard about the missing teenagers and wanted permission to help search. Ari agreed immediately. Hours passed in tense silence before the woodsman called again. This time, his voice carried urgency. He said he had encountered a man wandering drunk through the woods, rambling about things he should not have known, details that pointed directly to Liana and Felipe. The woodsman took him to the local police station. Once the man sobered up, everything spilled out. His name was Antonio Caetano da Silva. After days of hiding, drinking heavily, and panicking about the police closing in, Caetano had lost control. He wandered through the area talking too much, saying names, describing locations, and revealing the first concrete link to the group that had taken Liana and Felipe. Caetano was known as a hanger-on, not a mastermind. but someone who followed the wrong people and participated without thinking through consequences. Police pressure intensified rapidly, and the atmosphere inside the group shifted from arrogance to panic. For the first time since the abduction, the men understood that they were no longer in control of the situation. They were being hunted, roads were being checked, locals were being questioned, and helicopters were now scanning the very area they thought would protect them. That night, Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, fled. He left abruptly, disappearing into the darkness and heading away from Embu-Guaçu, desperate to save himself before the police arrived. But his escape did not calm the situation, it made it worse. His departure confirmed what the others already feared, that this was no longer a shared plan, but a collapsing one. With Pernambuco gone, Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champinha, reached a conclusion that had been forming since Felipe's death. Liana was now the only witness left. If she survived, everything would unravel. The houses, the forest paths, the faces, the names, all of it would lead back to them. The problem they believed they had solved with Felipe now stood in front of them again. Champinha told the others he was going to release Liana. He said he would take her to a nearby bus stop and let her go. Still, no one stopped him. Liana followed Champinha because she had no strength left to resist. She was barefoot, exhausted, and barely speaking, and by that point, compliance felt safer than questioning what she was told. But Champinha did not lead her toward any road or bus stop. Instead, he walked her deeper into the forest, away from clear paths and toward thicker brush, where the sounds of helicopters faded and the silence returned. He used a machete, striking her in the neck and upper body. The attack was not a single blow, and it did not stop immediately. Liana reacted instinctively, trying to move away and escape, but she was barefoot, exhausted from days of captivity, and physically weakened. She managed only a few steps before collapsing, unable to outrun what was already unfolding. Champinha continued until she no longer moved. Once it was over, he did not stay with the body. He gathered his clothes and the machete, wrapped them together, and hid them in a nearby well, believing that removing those items would erase his connection to what he had done. He then left the forest alone, abandoning Liana's body where it fell, concealed by vegetation and distance. What had begun as a kidnapping had turned into multiple murders, and the group that once believed the forest protected them now scattered in panic, knowing there was no version of this that ended quietly. Afterward, everything collapsed. The men scattered, some hiding in the forest, others returning home, hoping distance would protect them from consequences. But it was already too late. Felipe's body had been discovered, and the case had changed completely. This was no longer a search for missing teenagers. It was now a murder investigation, and every one of them was on the radar. Days later, Liana Bay Friedenbach's body was found in the forest where she had been taken. And one by one, the suspects were arrested. Some talked immediately, attempting to reduce their responsibility by shifting blame, while others denied involvement until evidence forced their silence. The stories conflicted at first, but timelines, locations, and forensic findings closed the gaps they tried to leave open. When the case reached court, the roles of each participant were separated carefully because the crimes had not been equal in nature or responsibility. Antonio Caetano da Silva was convicted for multiple acts connected to the captivity and sexual violence and received a sentence of 124 years in prison, reflecting both his participation and his failure to intervene at critical moments. Agnaldo Pires, whose involvement centered on S.A. during Liana's captivity, was sentenced to 47 years, a punishment tied directly to the harm he chose to inflict. Antonio Matias de Barros, the owner of the second house, was convicted for illegal imprisonment, concealment, and aiding the perpetrators, but not for S.A., and his sentence reflected that distinction. He received 6 years of imprisonment and additional detention, a reminder that allowing crimes to happen carried its own consequences, even without direct violence. Paulo Cesar da Silva Marques, known as Pernambuco, faced trial separately and was convicted of multiple crimes, including aggravated homicide, kidnapping, and S.A. The court sentenced him to 110 years and 18 days in prison, acknowledging both his actions and the prolonged nature of the crimes. He remained incarcerated from that point forward, with no ambiguity about his role. Roberto Aparecido Alves Cardoso, known as Champinha, stood apart from the others in one crucial way. He was a minor at the time of the crimes, which meant the criminal court could not sentence him as an adult. Instead, he was placed under juvenile detention, but medical evaluations changed the course of his future. Psychiatric assessments concluded that he posed a continuing danger to society, and when he reached adulthood, the courts ordered his indefinite psychiatric confinement, a decision upheld repeatedly despite multiple appeals. The trials closed the legal chapter, but the damage could not be undone. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
In almost 30 years of policing, the level of depravity shown by Andrew Innes is way beyond anything myself or my colleagues had witnessed before. Not only did he callously take the life of a young mother and innocent child, he then sought to escape justice by burying their bodies beneath his kitchen floor. He showed no regard for human life or for the remorse or suffering that he's brought to their...
At 3:20 in the afternoon on March 5th, 2021, police officers stood outside a modest house on Troon Avenue in Dundee, a quiet residential street that, until that moment, had drawn no national attention. In the middle of a strict COVID lockdown, when travel across the UK was tightly restricted and heavily monitored, a car had been traced crossing hundreds of miles from England into Scotland, and that journey had connected directly to the disappearance of a 25-year-old mother named Benny Lynn Burke and her 2-year-old daughter Jellica. Inside that house was a 7-year-old girl who was not related to the man who answered the door. They were there because phone records, CCTV, and vehicle tracking had narrowed their search to this address, and because for days, a family in the Philippines and a former partner in England had been asking the same question without getting a clear answer. Where was Benny Lynn? When the officers asked Andrew Innes, a 50-year-old man who lived alone at that address, where she was, he did not hesitate, he did not ask for a lawyer, and he did not attempt to invent another explanation. He simply told them in a steady voice, "I killed her. She's under the floor." And when they asked about her 2-year-old daughter, he answered just as calmly, saying, "Under the floor with her mom." In that moment, the search for a missing mother turned into a double investigation, and what investigators would uncover beneath the concrete of that kitchen floor would reveal planning, deception, digital grooming that would later be described in court as among the very worst crimes to come before Scotland's High Court. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. But before she became a headline, before her name was spoken in courtrooms and police briefings, Benny Lynn Aquino Burke had been a daughter, a sister, a young mother who carried far more responsibility than most people her age ever had to. She was born in November 1995 in the Philippines, and she grew up in a family that did not have much. So from an early age, she understood what sacrifice looked like and what it meant to work for something instead of expecting it to arrive. Her parents pooled what little money they had to make sure she stayed in school, and she did not waste that opportunity because she knew that her education was not just for her, it was for all of them. She was especially protective of her younger brother, stepping in when he was bullied and standing up for him. And even after she left home, even after she crossed time zones and oceans, she remained deeply connected to her family, calling her sister Sheila every single day, despite the time difference between the UK and the Philippines, because routine mattered to her and connection mattered even more. In July 2018, she married Lexington Burke in a ceremony in Samar, and just weeks later, in August 2018, she gave birth to her daughter, Jellica, and in that short stretch of time, her life seemed to accelerate forward into everything she had hoped for. But by the end of 2020, the marriage had begun to break down, and whatever stability she thought she had secured started to unravel, so she found herself moving into emergency accommodation in Kingswood near Bristol. However, she did not collapse under that pressure. Instead, she kept going. She worked part-time in a care home, and she sold items online, including car vacuums and small household goods, and she joined a local support network called Mums in Bath, where other mothers helped each other with advice, childcare swaps, and practical support. But freedom did not cancel out loneliness, and even though she had friends and support groups, and even though she spoke to her sister daily, there was still an emptiness that comes after a marriage ends, especially when you are in a different country and raising a child largely on your own. So in early 2021, she did something that thousands of people do every day without thinking twice about it. She joined a dating site, hoping that maybe this time she would meet someone kind, someone stable, someone who would not complicate her life, but instead help steady it. And that was where she met Andrew Innes. Andrew Innes was 50 years old in early 2021, and if someone had skimmed through his resume or glanced at his LinkedIn profile, they would have seen something that looked stable and professional. He had been born in 1970 on a British military base in Germany, and he grew up in Scotland before going on to attend the University of Aberdeen, where he trained in computing and eventually built a career in software development. He was intelligent, technically skilled, and capable of building complex systems. And for a period of his life, that skill set had taken him far from Dundee. He had lived in Japan with a wife and children, working in the tech industry and building what outwardly appeared to be a conventional family life. But that structure collapsed, and by 2019, he had been deported from Japan and forced to return to Scotland alone. He had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which required steroid medication at times, and he was also diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. But what stood out was not a medical condition, but a pattern of isolation. Neighbors described him as withdrawn and distant, someone who kept to himself and did not build strong community ties. His posts became increasingly bitter, sometimes resentful, and occasionally fixated on past relationships. But the most revealing behavior was that instead of creating a single dating profile after returning to Scotland, he created more than 30, most of them targeting Filipino dating platforms. He built a scraper tool, a piece of software designed to extract and sort user data efficiently, and he used that tool to filter women according to specific criteria. He narrowed his search to women in their mid to late 20s, and he focused particularly on those who had young daughters. And then he compiled the information into spreadsheets, where he rated and compared them based on age, height, weight, and parental status. And within that organized digital search, one profile eventually stood out to him, and that profile belonged to a 25-year-old single mother living in Kingswood named Benilyn Aquino Burke. They met on Filipino Cupid, a platform built for connection across countries and cultures. He asked about her life in England, and she told him about working part-time in a care home, about raising Jellica mostly on her own, and about trying to rebuild after the end of her marriage. And he presented himself as stable, educated, and financially secure. However, he began offering solutions to problems she had not explicitly asked him to solve. He told her he could offer her a job in Dundee, something administrative, something tied to community work, and he promised £1,000 a month, which for someone juggling childcare and part-time income was not insignificant. He also offered accommodation, suggesting that she and Jellica could stay with him, and he framed it as an opportunity, as a way to start fresh somewhere quieter and safer. She did not immediately accept that idea, and she did not agree to relocate, but she stayed in contact because the possibility of stability, even hypothetical stability, can be persuasive when you are rebuilding your life. Then he asked her for intimate photos, and that request introduced a line she would not cross. She refused, and she did not send him anything explicit, and that refusal mattered because it demonstrated that she maintained boundaries even while exploring the relationship. However, she did not cut off contact entirely, and instead the conversations continued, and by early February they agreed that he would drive down to meet her in person. On February 12th, they finalized plans, and he began preparing for that trip. What she did not know, and what investigators would later uncover, was that in the days leading up to that journey, his online activity had shifted in a way that did not match the tone of a man planning a romantic visit. Before traveling to England, he searched for phrases including "what is chloroform used for?" and "underfloor storage," and "rates in Scotland," and those searches were not isolated curiosities, but clustered together in a short span of time. Then he purchased items from B&Q, including a hammer, cement, gravel, and various DIY tools. And a skip was delivered to his home shortly afterward, as though renovation work was imminent. He then drove more than 400 miles during a national lockdown, crossing from Scotland into England, and although travel restrictions were strict at the time, he made the journey anyway, framing it as a romantic gesture. When he arrived, he did not check into a hotel. Instead, he slept in his car, and he made sure she knew that, and she felt sorry for him. She saw a man who had driven across the country to see her and who was now resting uncomfortably in a vehicle, and that detail humanized him in her eyes. So when he suggested that she and the children come back with him to Dundee for the weekend, she agreed. They did not pack overnight bags, and they did not prepare for a long stay, because the plan, at least from her perspective, was temporary. It was a weekend visit, nothing more, and she believed she would return home afterward. That small detail, the absence of luggage, would later become one of the quiet indicators that she had not intended to disappear, because everything about that trip suggested she expected to come back. So, on February 18th, 2021, the car left England and headed north toward Scotland, and inside that vehicle were 4 people who each understood the journey differently. Andrew Innes was driving, focused on the road ahead, and in the passenger seat sat Benny Lynn, hopeful but cautious, while in the back were 2 children, her 2-year-old daughter Jellica, and a 7-year-old girl who would later be referred to in court as Jane Doe. To Benny Lynn, this was a short trip, a weekend visit to see where Andrew lived and to decide whether there was any real future in what had started online. But to Andrew, the significance of that drive was layered with intentions she did not yet see. And during the journey, she called her sister Sheila on FaceTime, and she did what she always did when something new was happening in her life. She shared it. She flipped the camera around so that Sheila could see Andrew in the driver's seat. And when they arrived in Dundee, the days that followed looked ordinary on the surface. Sheila, watching from a distance through video calls and messages, encouraged her sister gently. She had seen Benny Lynn struggle through the breakdown of her marriage, and she wanted her to find happiness again, so she said, "Maybe this time it will work." However, what neither Sheila nor Benny Lynn realized was that this would be the last normal conversation they would have. By February 23, 2021, inside the kitchen at 21 Troon Avenue, Benny Lynn was cooking, moving between the stove and the counter in a space she had only been in for a few days. And in that moment, there was no indication that this ordinary domestic scene would become the center of a murder investigation. The only direct witness to what happened next was the 7-year-old girl who would later testify under the protection of anonymity, and her words in court were simple but devastating. She said, "He had a heavy hammer," and she described him striking Benny Lynn while she was in the kitchen. And after the initial assault, he left the kitchen and then returned holding a long-bladed knife, and Jane Doe later described that sequence as though she were replaying a moment she could not erase. "I couldn't speak, because she was overwhelmed and frightened and unable to communicate clearly. Benny Lynn's body was wrapped, and steps were taken to conceal what had happened. And over the following hours and days, a section of the kitchen floor was opened up, concrete was poured, and fresh tiles were laid as though renovation work had simply accelerated unexpectedly. A skip remained outside the property, reinforcing the appearance that ordinary home improvement was taking place, and from the street it looked like nothing more than routine DIY. When police eventually questioned him, Andrew claimed that she had attacked him first, saying, "She came at me with a sushi knife," and he framed the killing as self-defense, describing a confrontation in which he had responded to a perceived threat. However, CCTV footage would later show him purchasing a hammer in the days before the trip, and investigators would piece together the timeline of those earlier internet searches and hardware purchases. And that evidence did not align with a spontaneous act of self-protection. Instead, it pointed toward preparation, and it contradicted the narrative he offered once he was under arrest. But that was only the beginning. After Benny Lynn was killed, Jellica was still there, and for 2 to 3 days, she remained alive inside that same property where her mother had just been buried beneath the kitchen floor. Andrew later told investigators that Jellica wanted her mother, and he described her crying and searching for her, framing her distress as something he found difficult to manage. However, that statement did not exist in isolation because Jane Doe provided her own account of those days. When Andrew was later questioned about what happened to Jellica, he did not deny responsibility, and instead he offered a justification that would echo in court. He said, "It seemed logical to put her with her mom," reducing a child's life to a sentence that attempted to rationalize the irreversible. He framed it as inevitability, as though he had arrived at a conclusion rather than committed an act, and that phrasing would become central to the prosecution's argument that his actions were not driven by uncontrollable psychosis but by deliberate choice. Afterward, Jellica was buried beside her mother beneath the same section of concrete, and from the street, nothing signaled that a 2-year-old child had been placed beneath that kitchen floor alongside the woman who had raised her. By February 22nd, something had already shifted in the pattern that Sheila knew so well, because her sister did not miss daily calls without explanation, and silence was not part of their routine. So when messages stopped coming and video calls were not returned, she reached out directly to Andrew, addressing him politely at first, because she still believed she was speaking to someone who cared about Benny Lynn's safety. She wrote, "Sir, what happened to my sister?" And the word sir reflected both respect and uncertainty, because she was asking for reassurance from the man who was supposed to be hosting her sister in his home. Andrew responded quickly. He told her, "She's perfectly fine," and then added, "She's in Glasgow," shifting the location away from Dundee and placing distance between himself and any immediate concern. He continued saying, "Scotland is peaceful," as though geography alone could replace proof of life. And he constructed a narrative in which Benny Lynn had chosen to leave his home voluntarily. He claimed that a teacher had become involved, and he suggested that Benny Lynn was hiding from Lexington, her former partner, framing the situation as one in which she needed to disappear for her own protection. He said she had discarded her phone, which conveniently explained why no one could reach her, and he layered these claims in a way that sounded plausible on the surface, but avoided providing anything concrete. And when Sheila pressed further and asked directly, "Can you tell me my sister is alive?" he did not answer the question in the way she needed, and instead, he circled back to general assurances without offering specific proof. At one point, he even mentioned wiping his devices so that police would not be able to trace Benny Lynn, suggesting that any digital trail would be erased. Then he sent a video clip as reassurance, but investigators would later determine that it was an old recording, repurposed to simulate normality. Sheila, still holding on to hope and trying to remain calm, ended one exchange with, "I hope we can chat again," and Andrew replied, "Maybe one day once the dust has settled," a phrase that in retrospect sounded less like reassurance and more like closure spoken too early. But by early March, the explanations no longer held, and what had begun as a family's private concern had escalated into a cross-border investigation. Benny Lynn had missed a scheduled social work appointment, which was out of character, and Lexington had reported that he could not reach her. So Avon and Somerset police began tracing movements and phone activity. CCTV footage and vehicle tracking revealed something critical. Andrew Innes's car had traveled from Dundee to Kingswood during lockdown restrictions, and then returned north shortly afterward, and that journey placed him at the center of the timeline. So Police Scotland were contacted, and the address on Troon Avenue became the next step. At 3:20 in the afternoon on March 5th, officers arrived at the property. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, although a skip stood nearby, suggesting ongoing renovation, and that detail immediately aligned with the purchases investigators had already begun to examine. And when officers knocked, Andrew answered, and at first he refused them entry, claiming he was isolating due to COVID guidelines and implying that he could not allow anyone inside. However, as they spoke, officers noticed a young girl inside the house, fully dressed and alert, and that observation contradicted his explanation about who was present. When they questioned him about the child, it became clear she was not his daughter, and once they spoke directly to her, the reality began to surface. Inside the property, officers observed that the kitchen units had been removed, utensils were stacked awkwardly on the stairs, and sections of flooring appeared newly laid, and those visual details did not match the calm reassurances he had been sending to Sheila days earlier. Then, without prolonged denial or visible agitation, Andrew shifted the tone of the encounter completely. When asked where Benny Lynn was, he said, "I killed her, she's under the floor." When they asked about 2-year-old Jellica, he replied, "Under the floor with her mom. The child was screaming," adding an explanation that suggested justification rather than remorse. At that moment, the missing persons inquiry ended, and a double investigation began, and Andrew Innes was arrested immediately at the scene while officers secured the property and prepared for what they now understood would be a recovery operation beneath the kitchen floor. Once Andrew was arrested, the house on Troon Avenue stopped being a private residence and became an active crime scene, and what followed was an excavation that lasted nearly 2 weeks. Officers sealed the property, forensic teams entered carefully, and specialists were brought in. The kitchen floor was cut open section by section, and as the concrete was broken apart, layers were lifted slowly, methodically, so that every fragment could be documented. What had appeared to be a renovation from the outside was now understood as concealment, and on March 19th, after days of controlled digging, the bodies of Benilyn and Angelica were recovered from beneath that floor. The space where meals had once been prepared had become a burial site, and the physical evidence preserved beneath it would define the next stage of the case. Post-mortem examinations confirmed that Benilyn had suffered severe head trauma consistent with being struck by a heavy object, as well as injuries to her chest and signs of internal bleeding, and those findings aligned with Jane Doe's account of the assault in the kitchen. Angelica's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation caused by pressure applied to her neck and mouth, and that detail established that her death had not been accidental or incidental, but inflicted. However, the forensic picture extended beyond the killings themselves, because inside the property, investigators recovered additional items that would shape the prosecution's case. A used condom was found in a bin, and DNA testing linked it to Andrew, as well as biological material from Angelica, and black furry handcuffs recovered from the house contained DNA evidence that tied him to further. A sock tested positive for saliva, and laboratory analysis revealed a match for chlamydia between Andrew and the surviving child, creating a biological link that could not be dismissed as coincidence. But when confronted with these findings, Andrew denied SA, stating, "I never touched the girl," and he attempted to separate himself from the forensic narrative that was unfolding. However, the DNA evidence did not support his denial, and the consistency of the biological matches contradicted his statements in a way that could not be explained by accident or misunderstanding. And as the forensic reports accumulated, the case against him expanded from concealment and homicide to include sexual offenses supported by scientific evidence. And the courtroom battle that followed would hinge not only on what he said happened, but on what the evidence proved had occurred inside that house. The trial began on January 31st, 2023, at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. And by then, the details of what had happened on Troon Avenue had already traveled far beyond Dundee. The courtroom was presided over by Lord Beckett, and as proceedings opened, Andrew Innes did not contest the fact that he had killed Benilyn and Angelica. Instead, he admitted the killings while denying, and that distinction became the foundation of his defense. He claimed self-defense first, telling the court that Benilyn had attacked him with a knife and that he had reacted in the moment. But that explanation did not hold when examined against the digital evidence of prior searches and purchases. So the narrative shifted. He began describing auditory hallucinations, suggesting that he had heard voices, and then he introduced the idea of steroid-induced psychosis, arguing that medication prescribed for Crohn's disease had destabilized his mental state. Then he offered another explanation that further complicated his defense, describing what he called a hybrid vision, in which Benilyn appeared to him as a fusion of his estranged wife and a former partner, and he implied that this distorted perception contributed to his behavior. However, each of these claims was tested against medical testimony, and that was where the prosecution's case strengthened. Dr. Gordon Cowan, a consultant forensic psychiatrist who had met with Innes multiple times, testified that there was no credible evidence of psychosis during the period in question, and he explained that steroid-induced psychosis was extremely rare. He told the court that Innes demonstrated logical thinking throughout the events, including during concealment and communication afterward, and that there was structure and planning in his behavior that contradicted a sudden mental break. One of the most difficult moments in the trial came when Jane Doe's pre-recorded interview was played to the jury, a 90-minute account from a child describing what she had witnessed and endured, and the emotional weight of that testimony was such that jurors were offered counseling support. But during the proceedings, Innes accused her of lying, attempting to undermine her credibility, yet the forensic evidence presented alongside her account reinforced her statements. But, at a point, he admitted that if police had arrived 24 hours later, the surviving child might also have been killed. Now everything rested on whether 12 jurors believed that Andrew Innes had acted in panic or in planning. And after approximately 2.5 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom, and the verdicts were read aloud, one by one. He was found guilty of the Benilyn Burke and her 2-year-old daughter Angelica, and he was also convicted of the sexual offenses tied to the forensic evidence presented during the trial. And when it came time for sentencing, Lord Beckett addressed the court directly and described the crimes as amongst the very worst crimes which have come before the High Court, emphasizing both the violence inflicted and the calculated concealment that followed. He imposed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years before Andrew Innes could even be considered for parole, and that minimum was backdated to March 8, 2021, the date shortly after his arrest when he had been remanded into custody.
Woman and her 2-year-old daughter in a situation where they had trusted you and travelled with you from Bristol to your home in Dundee. These are amongst the very worst crimes which have come before the High Court of Justiciary. Considering the whole circumstances, the punishment part on the 2 charges of murder will be one of 36 years, backdated to 8th March 2021. This does not mean that this is a sentence of 36 years. You are sentenced to life imprisonment, and you will serve at least 36 years before you can be considered for release on parole. It will be for the parole board to determine whether you will ultimately be released, and they will consider the safety of the public in reaching that decision.
An appeal was lodged in the months that followed, challenging aspects of the conviction and sentence, but those efforts were rejected, and the outcome of the trial remained intact. Andrew Innes was transferred to a high-security prison in Scotland, where he continues to serve his sentence, and while the legal process reached its conclusion within the structure of the court, the impact of what happened on Troon Avenue extended far beyond that room and far beyond the years assigned to his imprisonment.
Almost 30 years of policing, the level of depravity shown by Andrew Innes is way beyond anything myself or my colleagues had witnessed before. Not only did he callously take the life of a young mother and innocent child, he then sought to escape justice by burying their bodies beneath his kitchen floor. He showed no regard for human life or for the remorse or suffering that he's brought to their loved ones. I'd like to end by thanking the family of Benel and Angelica for their courage they've shown throughout what's been a horrific ordeal, and I hope this conviction in some way helps to bring them a degree of closure. Thank you very much. This is probably one of the most horrific cases that I and my team have been involved in, and it's to credit to everyone involved with the commitment and professionalism they showed to secure justice for Benel and Angelica. The National Crime Agency described this as a once-in-a-generation crime, and I sincerely hope that no one else sees this ever again.
So when the trial ended and the sentence was handed down, the legal process reached its formal conclusion. But for Benny Lynn's family, there was no sense of completion, only a different stage of grief. Her father traveled from the Philippines to Scotland to sit through the proceedings, listening to details no parent ever expects to hear. And when he later spoke about the loss, he did not describe anger first. He described the emptiness that followed him home. He said he cried every day because the absence of his daughter and granddaughter had reshaped the rhythm of his life in a way that no verdict could reverse. Sheila, who had once spoken to Benny Lynn every single day despite the time difference, found herself replaying their last normal conversations. And sometimes she still called her sister's phone just to hear her voicemail greeting, because that recorded voice was the closest thing she had left. However, she also carried the weight of those final messages, the questions she had asked Andrew, the reassurances he had given, and the realization that the answers she was searching for at the time had already been buried beneath concrete. In Bristol, where Benny Lynn had tried to rebuild her life, a vigil was held at Brandon Hill, and friends, neighbors, and members of the local Filipino community gathered quietly. There were white balloons released into the air, candles placed carefully along the grass, and handwritten notes left beside flowers, and one message stood out for its simplicity: "You are loved, you are missed, you are remembered." The Kanlungan organization, which supports Filipino migrants in the UK, spoke publicly about the broader vulnerability faced by migrant women, highlighting how isolation, financial pressure, and cultural displacement can intersect in dangerous ways when trust is placed in the wrong person. So the case did not end as a single tragedy, but became part of a larger conversation about protection, accountability, and the hidden risks that can exist behind online connections. But Benny Lynn's father chose to channel his grief into advocacy, stating that he wanted to dedicate his life to defending the rights of women and children. Andrew Innes will serve at least 36 years before he can even request consideration for release, and within the legal system, that sentence represents justice as defined by statute. However, for Benny Lynn's family, And for the child who survived and will carry the memory of what she witnessed, there is no calculation that restores what was taken. There is no number of years that balances the absence at the dinner table, the missed birthdays, or the daily phone calls that will never come again. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.